I'm sure your parents were probably like mine when they said, you know, there are three things you don't talk about in public, and that's race, religion, and politics, with race being the first instance. It's not an easy conversation, but it is an absolutely necessary one, not just for us as lawyers, but for me and my colleagues in law enforcement as well. And I'll tell two stories to illustrate that. I shared this story at lunch. Recently, my wife and I took our three kids, who are ages 9, 11, and 13, to see the movie about Jesse Owens, Race. We saw it a couple weeks ago. My wife and I enjoyed it. It's not the greatest movie, but we were inspired by the story about what transpired back then. And we came out, and we were talking about how great it was, and we asked the kids, what did you think about this? And they universally said, oh, it was awful. It was terrible. We hated it. And I said, why? And they said, it's all about black people and black issues. And I looked at my wife, who's African American, and I looked at my three kids, who are African American, and I said, but you're black. And they all said, well, it doesn't matter anymore. We don't need to talk about it. We need to just stop talking about it and move on. They were not comfortable with the conversation and with the issues that were brought up by the movie. The second story goes to a defendant recently released from prison outside of San Francisco. He had gone in the mid-1970s for a violent crime. As he was driving across the Golden Gate Bridge to go to prison, the bridge was shut down by protesters, and this is in 1975, 1976, who were protesting police misconduct, particularly against minority communities. And they had to maneuver through this protest that had shut down the bridge before he could get to prison. He went to prison for 40 years. When he came out of prison, he was driving back across the Golden Gate Bridge, back into San Francisco, and members of the Black Lives Matter movement had shut down the bridge, protesting police misconduct, particularly against minority communities. And he relayed the story how he just broke down in tears because he felt nothing had changed in the 40 years that he was in prison. So these are uncomfortable topics, but they're relevant, particularly in terms of perception. And perception matters. There is a perception that certain communities are policed differently and more harshly than others, and that when police or other law enforcement agencies are shown to have engaged in some misconduct, that those officers are not held accountable. There's a perception that our criminal justice system is not working properly, and perception matters. And that's why about 4 years ago, a group of U.S. attorneys formed a racial disparities working group, which I chair, because we felt it was important to address those perceptions. I think some of those perceptions are real, but I also think some of those perceptions are misperceptions, and it was important for us to drill down on what was actually going on so that we could answer questions. And I would get questions as a U.S. attorney: is this an epidemic of shootings, of police shootings? Are we at the highest level ever of unarmed people being shot by police? Is this racism? What's going on? And I couldn't answer the questions because we didn't have data. We didn't know exactly what was going on. We had a lot of anecdotes across the country, but we didn't know. So we formed this working group 4 years ago, and we've met periodically over the last 4 years. We've met with academics, we've met with public defenders, with prosecutors, law enforcement agencies, all types of people to get information and try to get this data. And then we made recommendations to the Attorney General, recommending changes that could address these perceptions and hopefully improve belief and restore trust in the criminal justice system. And I'm proud to say that several of those suggestions have been taken up. They include dialing back the use of mandatory minimums and restricting them to the top-level drug dealers, for example, and not the girlfriends and the mopes and other folks. We recommended that there be an actual study of sentencing, similar to what the Sentencing Commission did, I think 4 or 5 years ago, but something more updated, to look at what has happened since 2005 when the Booker decision was handed down. What has happened in terms of sentencing disparities, if any? We thought that it was important to document that and analyze it so that it could be published and reviewed and acted upon. And sure enough, the report came back last fall and showed that there were discrepancies among black and white defendants when you if you hold the criminal activity or the crime the same and you hold their criminal history the same, there are discrepancies that have actually increased since 2005. Interestingly, there aren't discrepancies that were found between black women and white women. For whatever reason, sentencing discrepancies did not exist there since 2005, but they have grown for men since 2005. The study did not explain why, but I think the conversation we're having today takes a step in that direction. I think there's a lot more to be done to investigate these problems, but the first step is actually doing them, taking those steps and drilling down. So the judge asked, is this important for prosecutors? It's absolutely important for us because, as the judge showed and Professor Wald showed, everybody is impacted by biases, whether you're a doctor, a lawyer, a prosecutor, a defense attorney. We all carry them. And the great thing about implicit bias is it's measurable and not necessarily entirely fixable, but you can improve it. You can do something to reduce it. And I asked recently on a panel similar to this, is this implicit bias stuff, is this just like diversity? There was a big move for diversity 10, 15 years ago, and then diversity turned into inclusion. And isn't this just the latest fad towards addressing racial issues in this country? And what I was told and what I believe is this is different. This is scientifically provable, and it is possible to address the biases that we all share, which I think is absolutely critical going forward. And it's critical for the Department of Justice to do what we're doing. And I say that because I went to a conference comprised of district attorney representatives and state prosecutor representatives, and room probably about 150 people. And I asked the question, how many of your offices are addressing implicit bias through training or developing training programs? And I would say out of that 150 people, 4 people raised their hands and said that we're doing something about it. So I'm hoping that the Department of Justice taking this step, saying it's an issue, saying it's a problem, will help lead other prosecutors' offices to do the same thing. We're not at the very front. Cy Vance in Manhattan, John Chisholm in Milwaukee have gone even further and actually did an in-depth study of their offices, a 2-year study each, using the Vera Institute of Justice to look at each point, discretion point that the prosecutors had to determine and analyze to see whether race impacted any of their decisions. And they were then able to go to the communities that they represented and said, they could say, this perception is accurate and this is what we're doing to fix it. This perception is inaccurate and this is why. They actually had the data to back up what they were doing as prosecutors, which I think is critical to us being successful going forward. So I'm going to conclude there because I know we don't have a lot of time, and I think we have questions. But my basic plea is we all need to lean into the uncomfortable. As I said in the beginning, this is not necessarily an easy conversation, not a pleasant conversation all the time, but it's absolutely critical that we engage in it from a prosecutor's perspective, because I do believe the credibility of the system rests on us getting it right. Thank you very much.
That's that crack music, nigga. That real black music, nigga. That's that crack music, nigga. That real black music, nigga. How we stop the Black Panthers? Ronald Reagan cooked up an answer. You hear that?
The Katherine Massey Book Club, Context of White Supremacy. Gus T, Renegade, in for another broadcast, hopefully to share constructive information on the global system of white supremacy. Today's date, Friday, May 22nd, 2026. So I have been told our 6th installment on Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. We are picking up on Chapter 3, The Color of Justice. Who was that odd fellow talking at the beginning there? That was Carter M. Stewart, former U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Ohio, and more importantly for our purposes, the husband of Michelle Alexander, who she told us at the very beginning in the preface, he does not agree with what she has laid out in the book. That was the husband Mr. Michelle Alexander, speaking in March 2nd specifically, 2016, importantly, at the 30th National Institute on White Collar Crime in San Diego. Shout to the white supremacist terrorist attack that they just had at the Muslim mosque, Southern California, San Diego. Anyway, I thought that was a stunning and massively important segment to include as we push off into this week's segment, which will also discuss discretion. Really, I could have stopped at the very beginning. First 2 minutes. Did my mic drop? Gus T doing his research, went back and got that audio from 10 years ago, relevant to our study, and let's continue on reading this lying, lame book. Did you hear the first 3 minutes? February 2016, and that's basically 30 days, a little more, about 45 days after the passing of Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, and in the middle of Donald Trump en route to securing the White House. But they go to see the movie Race about the great Jesse Owens, victim of white supremacy, and Michelle Alexander and Carter M. Stewart's, their children, who were talked about at the beginning of this book, nursed by Michelle Alexander's white mother. They go to see Race, and their response is, ew, it's about black people. That right there. They didn't say it's about racism. He said, Carter M. Stewart, attorney, take him at his word. I'm going to say his testimony was accurate. He said, hey, we didn't like Jesse Owens, all about these black people. Talk about that ain't got nothing to do with it. Talk about all that black and black. In 2016, if you can remember everything, Donald Trump en route to the White House, Dr. Frances Cress Welsing just passed away. They're going to be talking about the same thing they mentioned in the sound clip, police violence against black people, the whole time. That even comes up during the election. And the children of Michelle Alexander, author of New Jim Crow, talking about all that. Are they looking at her book saying the same thing? Mama, you talking about all that black this and black that. I don't want to
That real black music, nigga.
That right there is exactly double whammy. That's what I would expect from the children of Carter M. Stewart, locking up black people in Ohio. That's what I would expect from lying Michelle Alexander with one white parent. That is exactly what I would expect. There's a few other things that I could, even when he said at the beginning that Carter M. Stewart said that his black parents said is 3 things you don't discuss in public: racism, politics, religion. And I went, racism? Excuse me, race. I have not heard a black person say that you don't discuss racism in public. I don't remember Neely Fuller Jr. saying that. I don't remember Dr. Welsing saying it. Has Obama said that? You don't discuss racism in public? I'm going to tell you like this. Knowing what I learned about Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, you can talk about it in private. Even if you are 19 years old, FBI director might be listening to your conversation anyway. So, ain't going to be no secrets. But I ain't heard that one before. You don't discuss racism in race. You don't discuss race in public. We ain't gonna never get this problem solved if that is the approach we take. It's a lot more that I could say, but I mean, wow. Michelle, I'm gonna marinate on that one a little bit more myself. Michelle Alexander, black get back. Stay over there. I did enjoy Jesse Owens' biopic. Katherine Massey Book Club, Context of White Supremacy, audio segment 1.
Being hope went from being a broke man to being a dope man to being a president. Look, it's hope, man. It's that inspiration for the moles and the folks, man. Shorty come and see his mama straight overdosing. And this is the soundtrack. This is the type of music that you make when you round that. Crack music, nigga. That real black music, nigga.
Chapter 3, The Color of Justice. Imagine you are Emma Faye Stewart, a 30-year-old, single, African-American mother of two who was arrested as part of a drug sweep in Hearne, Texas. All but one of the people arrested were African-American. You are innocent. After a week in jail, you have no one to care for your two small children and are eager to get home. Your court-appointed attorney urges you to plead guilty to a drug distribution charge, saying the prosecutor has offered probation. You refuse, steadfastly proclaiming your innocence. Finally, after almost a month in jail, you decide to plead guilty so you can return home to your children. Unwilling to risk a trial and years of imprisonment, you are sentenced to 10 years probation in order to pay $1,000 in fines, as well as court and probation costs. You are also now branded a drug felon. You are no longer eligible for food stamps. You may be discriminated against in employment. You cannot vote for at least 12 years, and you are about to be evicted from public housing. Once homeless, your children will be taken from you and put in foster care. A judge eventually dismisses all cases against the defendants who did not plead guilty. At trial, the judge finds that the entire sweep was based on the testimony of a single informant who lied to the prosecution. You, however, are still a drug felon, homeless, and desperate to regain custody of your children. Now place yourself in the shoes of Clifford Runnels, another African-American victim of the Hearne drug bust. You returned home to Bryan, Texas, to attend the funeral of your 18-month-old daughter. Before the funeral services begin, the police show up and handcuff you. You beg the officers to let you take one last look at your daughter before she's buried. The police refuse. You are told by prosecutors that you are needed to testify against one of the defendants in a recent drug bust. You deny witnessing any drug transaction. You don't know what they're talking about. Because of your refusal to cooperate, you are indicted on felony charges. After a month of being held in jail, the charges against you are dropped. You are technically free, but as a result of your arrest and period of incarceration, you lose your job, your apartment, your furniture, and your car. Not to mention the chance to say goodbye to your baby girl. This is the war on drugs. The brutal stories described above are not isolated incidents, nor are the racial identities of Emma Faye Stewart and Clifford Runnels random or accidental. In every state across our nation, African Americans, particularly in the poorest neighborhoods, are subjected to tactics and practices that would result in public outrage and scandal if committed in middle-class white neighborhoods. In the drug war, the enemy is racially defined. The law enforcement methods described in Chapter 2 have been employed almost exclusively in poor communities of color, resulting in jaw-dropping numbers of African Americans and Latinos filling our nation's prisons and jails every year. We are told by drug warriors that the enemy in this war is a thing, drugs, not a group of people, but the facts prove otherwise. Human Rights Watch reported in 2000 that in 7 states, African Americans constitute 80 to 90% of all drug offenders sent to prison. In at least 15 states, blacks are admitted to prison on drug charges at a rate from 20 to 57 times greater than that of white men. In fact, nationwide, the rate of incarceration for African American drug offenders dwarfs the rate of whites. When the war on drugs gained full steam in the mid-1980s, prison admissions for African Americans skyrocketed, nearly quadrupling in 3 years, and then increasing steadily until it reached in 2000 a level more than 26 times the level in 1983. The number of 2000 drug admissions for Latinos was 22 times the number of 1983 admissions. Whites have been admitted to prison for drug offenses at increased rates as well. The number of whites admitted for drug offenses in 2000 was 8 times the number admitted in 1983. But their relative numbers are small compared to blacks and Latinos. Although the majority of illegal drug users and dealers nationwide are white, 3/4 of all people imprisoned for drug offenses have been black or Latino. In recent years, rates of black imprisonment for drug offenses have dipped somewhat, declining approximately 25% from their zenith in the mid-1990s. But it remains the case that African Americans are incarcerated at grossly disproportionate rates throughout the United States. There is, of course, an official explanation for all of this: crime rates. This explanation has tremendous appeal, before you know the facts, for it is consistent with and reinforces dominant racial narratives about crime and criminality dating back to slavery. The truth, however, is that rates and patterns of drug crime don't explain the glaring racial disparities in our criminal justice system. People of all races use and sell illegal drugs at remarkably similar rates. If there are significant differences in the surveys to be found, they frequently suggest that whites, particularly white youth, are more likely to engage in illegal drug dealing than people of color. One study, for example, published in 2000 by the National Institute on Drug Abuse, reported that white students use cocaine at 7 times the rate of black students, use crack cocaine at 8 times the rate of black students, and use heroin at 7 times the rate of black students. That same survey revealed that nearly identical percentages of white and black high school seniors use marijuana. The National Household Survey on Drug Abuse reported in 2000 that white youth aged 12 through 17 are more than a third more likely to have sold illegal drugs than African American youth. Thus, the very same year, Human Rights Watch was reporting that African Americans were being arrested and imprisoned at unprecedented rates. Government data revealed that blacks were no more likely to be guilty of drug crimes than whites, and that white youth were actually the most likely of any racial or ethnic group to be guilty of illegal drug possession and sales. Any notion that drug use among blacks is more severe or dangerous is belied by the data. White youth have about 3 times the number of drug-related emergency room visits as their African American counterparts. The notion that whites comprise the vast majority of drug users and dealers, and may well be more likely than other racial groups to commit drug crimes, may seem implausible to some, given the media imagery we are fed on a daily basis and the racial composition of our prisons and jails. Upon reflection, however, the prevalence of white drug crime, including drug dealing, should not be surprising. After all, where do whites get their illegal drugs? Do they all drive to the ghetto to purchase them from somebody standing on a street corner? No. Studies consistently indicate that drug markets, like American society generally, reflect our nation's racial and socio-economic boundaries. Whites tend to sell to whites, blacks to blacks. University students tend to sell to each other. Rural whites, for their part, don't make a special trip to the hood to purchase marijuana. They buy it from somebody down the road. White high school students typically buy drugs from white classmates, friends, or older relatives. Even Barry McCaffrey, former director of the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy, once remarked, "If your child bought drugs, it was from a student of their own race generally." The notion that most illegal drug use and sales happens in the ghetto is pure fiction. Drug trafficking occurs there, but it occurs everywhere else in America as well. Nevertheless, black men have been admitted to state prison on drug charges at a rate that is more than 13 times higher than white men. The racial bias inherent in the drug war is a major reason that 1 in every 14 black men was behind bars in 2006, compared with 1 in 106 white men. For young black men, the statistics are even worse. 1 in 9 black men between the ages of 20 and 35 was behind bars in 2006, and far more were under some form of penal control, such as probation or parole. These gross racial disparities simply cannot be explained by rates of illegal drug activity among African Americans. What, then, does explain the extraordinary racial disparities in our criminal justice system? Old-fashioned racism seems out of the question. Politicians and law enforcement officials today rarely endorse racially biased practices, and most of them fiercely condemn racial discrimination of any kind. When accused of racial bias, police and prosecutors, like most Americans, express horror and outrage. Forms of race discrimination that were open and notorious for centuries were transformed in the 1960s and 1970s into something un-American, an affront to our newly conceived ethic of colorblindness. By the early 1980s, survey data indicated that 90% of whites thought black and white children should attend the same schools. 71% disagreed with the idea that whites have a right to keep blacks out of their neighborhoods. 80% indicated that they would support a black candidate for president, and 66% opposed laws prohibiting intermarriage. Although far fewer supported specific policies designed to achieve racial equality or integration, such as busing, the mere fact that large majorities of whites were, by the early 1980s, supporting the anti-discrimination principle reflected a profound shift in racial attitudes. The margin of support for colorblind norms has only increased since then. This dramatically changed racial climate has led defenders of mass incarceration to insist that our criminal justice system, whatever its past sins, is now largely fair and non-discriminatory. They point to violent crime rates in the African American community as a justification for the staggering number of black men who find themselves behind bars. Black men, they say, have much higher rates of violent crime. That's why so many of them are locked up. Typically, this is where the discussion ends. The problem with this abbreviated analysis is that violent crime is not responsible for mass incarceration. As numerous researchers have shown, violent crime rates have fluctuated over the years and bear little relationship to incarceration rates, which have soared during the past 3 decades, regardless of whether violent crime was going up or down. Today, violent crime rates are at historically low levels, yet incarceration rates continue to climb. Murder convictions tend to receive a tremendous amount of media attention, which feeds the public's sense that violent crime is rampant and forever on the rise. But like violent crime in general, the murder rate cannot explain the growth of the penal apparatus. Homicide convictions account for a tiny fraction of the growth in the prison population. In the federal system, for example, homicide offenders account for 0.4% of the past decade's growth in the federal prison population, while drug offenders account for nearly 61% of that expansion. In the state system, less than 3% of new court commitments to state prison typically involve people convicted of homicide. These facts may still leave some readers unsatisfied. The idea that the criminal justice system discriminates in such a terrific fashion when few people openly express or endorse racial discrimination may seem far-fetched, if not absurd. How could the war on drugs operate in a discriminatory manner on such a large scale when hardly anyone advocates or engages in explicit race discrimination? That question is the subject of this chapter. As we shall see, despite the colorblind rhetoric and fanfare of recent years, the design of the drug war effectively guarantees that those who are swept into the nation's new undercast are largely black and brown. This sort of claim invites skepticism. Non-racial explanations and excuses for the systematic mass incarceration of people of color are plentiful. It is the genius of the new system of control that it can always be defended on non-racial grounds, given the rarity of a noose or a racial slur in connection with any particular criminal case. Moreover, because blacks and whites are almost never similarly situated, given extreme racial segregation in housing and disparate life experiences, trying to control for race in an effort to evaluate whether the mass incarceration of people of color is really about race or something else, anything else, is difficult. But it isn't impossible. A bit of common sense is overdue in public discussions about racial bias in the criminal justice system. The great debate over whether black men have been targeted by the criminal justice system or unfairly treated in the war on drugs often overlooks the obvious. What is painfully obvious when one steps back from individual cases and specific policies is that the system of mass incarceration operates with stunning efficiency to sweep people of color off the streets, lock them in cages, and then release them into an inferior second-class status. Nowhere is this more true than in the war on drugs. The central question, then, is how exactly does a formerly colorblind criminal justice system achieve such racially discriminatory results? Rather easily, it turns out. The process occurs in 2 stages. The first step is to grant law enforcement officials extraordinary discretion regarding whom to stop, search, arrest, and charge for drug offenses, thus ensuring that conscious and unconscious racial beliefs and stereotypes will be given free rein. Unbridled discretion inevitably creates huge racial disparities. Then, the damning step. Close the courthouse doors to all claims by defendants and private litigants that the criminal justice system operates in racially discriminatory fashion. Demand that anyone who wants to challenge racial bias in the system offer in advance clear proof that the racial disparities are the product of intentional racial discrimination, i.e., the work of a bigot. This evidence will almost never be available in the era of colorblindness, because everyone knows, but does not say, that the enemy in the war on drugs can be identified by race. This simple design has helped to produce one of the most extraordinary systems of racialized social control the world has ever seen. Picking and choosing, the role of discretion. Chapter 2 described the first step in some detail, including the legal rules that grant police the discretion and authority to stop, interrogate, and search anyone, anywhere, provided they get consent from the targeted individual. It also examined the legal framework that affords prosecutors extraordinary discretion to charge or not charge, plea bargain or not, and load up defendants with charges carrying the threat of harsh mandatory sentences in order to force guilty pleas, even in cases in which the defendants may well be innocent. These rules have made it possible for law enforcement agencies to boost dramatically their rates of drug arrests and convictions, even in communities where drug crime is stable or declining. But that's not all. These rules have also guaranteed racially discriminatory results. The reason is this. Drug law enforcement is unlike most other types of law enforcement. When a violent crime or a robbery or a trespass occurs, someone usually calls the police. There is a clear victim and perpetrator. Someone is hurt or harmed in some way and wants the offender punished. But with drug crime, neither the purchaser of the drugs nor the seller has any incentive to contact law enforcement. It is consensual activity. Equally important, it is popular. The clear majority of Americans of all races have violated drug laws in their lifetime. In fact, in any given year, more than 1 in 10 Americans violate drug laws. But due to resource constraints and the politics of the drug war, only a small fraction are arrested, convicted, and incarcerated. In 2002, for example, there were 19.5 million illicit drug users, compared to 1.5 million drug arrests and 175,000 people admitted to prison for a drug offense. The ubiquity of illegal drug activity, combined with its consensual nature, requires a far more proactive approach by law enforcement than what is required to address ordinary street crime. It is impossible for law enforcement to identify and arrest every drug criminal. Strategic choices must be made about whom to target and what tactics to employ. Police and prosecutors did not declare the war on drugs, and some initially opposed it, but once the financial incentives for waging the war became too attractive to ignore, Law enforcement agencies had to ask themselves, if we're going to wage this war, where should it be fought, and who should be taken prisoner? That question was not difficult to answer, given the political and social context. As discussed in Chapter 1, the Reagan administration launched the media campaign a few years after the drug war was announced, in an effort to publicize horror stories involving black crack users and crack dealers in ghetto communities. Although crack cocaine had not yet hit the streets when the war on drugs was declared in 1982, its appearance a few years later created the perfect opportunity for the Reagan administration to build support for its new war. Drug use, once considered a private public health matter, was reframed through political rhetoric and media imagery as a grave threat to the national order. Jimmy Reeves and Richard Campbell show in their research how the media imagery surrounding cocaine changed as the practice of smoking cocaine came to be associated with poor blacks. In the early 1980s, the typical cocaine-related story focused on white recreational users who snorted the drug in its powder form. These stories generally relied on news sources associated with the drug treatment industry, such as rehabilitation clinics, and emphasized the possibility of recovery. By 1985, however, as the war on drugs moved into high gear, this frame was supplanted by a new siege paradigm, in which transgressors were poor, non-white users and dealers of crack cocaine. Law enforcement officials assumed the role of drug experts, emphasizing the need for law and order responses, a crackdown on those associated with the drug. These findings are consistent with numerous other studies, including a study of network television news from 1990 and 1991, which found that a predictable us-against-them frame was used in the news stories, with us being white suburban America and them being black Americans and a few corrupted whites. The media bonanza inspired by the administration's campaign solidified in the public imagination the image of the black drug criminal. Although explicitly racial political appeals remained rare, the calls for war at a time when the media was saturated with images of black drug crime left little doubt about who the enemy was in the war on drugs and exactly what he looked like. Jerome Miller, the former executive director of the National Center for Institutions and Alternatives, described the dynamic this way. There are certain code words that allow you never to have to say race, but everybody knows that's what you mean, and crime is one of those. So when we talk about locking up more and more people, what we're really talking about is locking up more and more black men. Another commentator noted, "It is unnecessary to speak directly of race today because speaking about crime is talking about race." Indeed, not long after the drug war was ramped up in the media and political discourse, almost no one imagined that drug criminals could be anything other than black. A survey was conducted in 1995 asking the following question: would you close your eyes for a second, envision a drug user, and describe that person to me? The startling results were published in the Journal of Alcohol and Drug Education. 95% of respondents pictured a black drug user, while only 5% imagined other racial groups. These results contrast sharply with the reality of drug crime in America. African Americans constituted only 15% of current drug users in 1995, and they constitute roughly that same percentage today. Whites constituted the vast majority of drug users then and now, but almost no one pictured a white person when asked to imagine what a drug user looks like. The same group of respondents also perceived the typical drug trafficker as black. There's no reason to believe that the survey results would have been any different if police officers or prosecutors, rather than the general public, had been the respondents. Law enforcement officials, no less than the rest of us, have been exposed to the racially charged political rhetoric and media imagery associated with the drug war. In fact, for nearly 3 decades, news stories regarding virtually all street crime have disproportionately featured African American offenders. One study suggests that the standard crime news script is so prevalent and so thoroughly racialized that viewers imagine a black perpetrator even when none exists. In that study, 60% of viewers who saw a story with no image falsely recalled seeing one, and 70% of those viewers believed the perpetrator to be African American. Decades of cognitive bias research demonstrates that both unconscious and conscious biases lead to discriminatory actions, even when an individual does not want to discriminate. The quotation commonly attributed to Nietzsche, that there is no immaculate perception, perfectly captures how cognitive schemas, thought structures, influence what we notice and how the things we notice get interpreted. Studies have shown that racial schemas operate not only as part of conscious, rational deliberations, but also automatically, without conscious awareness or intent. One study, for example, involved a video game that placed photographs of white and black individuals holding either a gun or an object, such as a wallet, soda can, or cell phone, into various photographic backgrounds. Participants were told to decide as quickly as possible whether to shoot the target. Consistent with earlier studies, participants were more likely to mistake a black target as armed when he was not, and mistake a white target as unarmed when in fact he was armed. This pattern of discrimination reflected automatic, unconscious thought processes, not careful deliberations. Most striking, perhaps, is the overwhelming evidence that implicit bias measures are disassociated from explicit bias measures. In other words, the fact that you may honestly believe that you are not biased against African Americans and that you may even have black friends or relatives does not mean that you are free from unconscious bias. Implicit bias tests may still show that you hold negative attitudes and stereotypes about blacks, even though you do not believe you do, and you don't want to. In the study described above, for example, black participants showed an amount of shooter bias similar to that shown by whites. Not surprisingly, people who have the greatest explicit bias, as measured by self-reported answers to survey questions, against a racial group, tend also to have the greatest implicit bias against them, and vice versa. Yet, there is often a weak correlation between degrees of explicit and implicit bias. Many people who think they are not biased prove, when tested, to have relatively high levels of bias. Unfortunately, a fairly consistent finding is that punitiveness and hostility almost always increase when people are primed, even subliminally, with images or verbal cues associated with African Americans. In fact, studies indicate that people become increasingly harsh when an alleged criminal is darker and more stereotypically black. They are more lenient when the accused is lighter and appears more stereotypically white. This is true of jurors as well as law enforcement officers. Viewed as a whole, the relevant research by cognitive and social psychologists to date suggests that racial bias in the drug war was inevitable. Once a public consensus was constructed by political and media elites that drug crime is black and brown. Once blackness and crime, especially drug crime, became conflated in the public consciousness, the criminal black man, as termed by legal scholar Katherine would inevitably become the primary target of law enforcement. Some discrimination would be conscious and deliberate, as many honestly and consciously would believe that black men deserve extra scrutiny and harsher treatment. Much racial bias, though, would operate unconsciously and automatically, even among law enforcement officials genuinely committed to equal treatment under the law. Whether or not one believes racial discrimination in the drug war was inevitable, it should have been glaringly obvious in the 1980s and 1990s that an extraordinarily high risk of racial bias in the administration of criminal justice was present, given the way in which all crime had been framed in the media and in political discourse. Awareness of this risk did not require intimate familiarity with cognitive bias research. anyone possessing a television set during this period would likely have had some awareness of the extent to which black men had been demonized in the war on drugs. The risk that African Americans would be unfairly targeted should have been of special concern to the U.S. Supreme Court, the one branch of government charged with the responsibility of protecting discrete and insular minorities from the excesses of majoritarian democracy and guaranteeing constitutional rights for groups deemed unpopular or subject to prejudice. Yet when the time came for the Supreme Court to devise the legal rules that would govern the war on drugs, the court adopted rules that would maximize, not minimize, the amount of racial discrimination that would likely occur. It then closed the courthouse doors to claims of racial bias. Wren versus United States is a case in point. As noted in Chapter 2, the court held in Wren that police officers are free to use minor traffic violations as an excuse to stop motorists for drug investigations, even when there is no evidence whatsoever that the motorist has engaged in drug crime. So long as a minor traffic violation, such as failing to use a turn signal, exceeding the speed limit by a mile or two, tracking improperly between the lines, or stopping on a pedestrian walkway, can be identified, police are free to stop motorists for the purpose of engaging in a fishing expedition for drugs. Such police conduct, the court concluded, does not violate the Fourth Amendment's ban on unreasonable searches and seizures. For good reason, the petitioners in Wren argued that granting police officers such broad discretion to investigate virtually anyone for drug crimes created a high risk that police would exercise their discretion in a racially discriminatory manner. With no requirement that any evidence of drug activity actually be present before launching a drug investigation, police officers' snap judgments regarding who seems like a drug criminal would likely be influenced by prevailing racial stereotypes and bias. They urged the court to prohibit the police from stopping motorists for the purpose of drug investigations unless the officers actually had reason to believe a motorist was committing or had committed a drug crime. Failing to do so, they argued, was unreasonable under the Fourth Amendment and would expose African Americans to a high risk of discriminatory stops and searches. Not only did the court reject the petitioner's central claim that using traffic stops as a pretext for drug investigations is unconstitutional, it ruled that claims of racial bias could not be brought under the Fourth Amendment. In other words, the court barred any victim of race discrimination by the police from even alleging a claim of racial bias under the Fourth Amendment. According to the court, whether or not police discriminate on the basis of race when making traffic stops is irrelevant to a consideration of whether their conduct is reasonable under the Fourth Amendment. The court did offer one caveat, however. It indicated that victims of race discrimination could still state a claim under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, which guarantees equal treatment under the laws. This suggestion may have been reassuring to those unfamiliar with the court's equal protection jurisprudence, but for those who have actually tried to prove race discrimination under the 14th Amendment, the court's remark amounted to cruel irony. As we shall see below, the Supreme Court has made it virtually impossible to challenge racial bias in the criminal justice system under the 14th Amendment, and it has barred litigation of such claims under federal civil rights laws as well. Closing the courthouse doors. McCleskey versus Kemp. First, consider sentencing. In 1987, when media hysteria regarding black drug crime was at a fever pitch, and the evening news was saturated with images of black criminals shackled in courtrooms, the Supreme Court ruled in McCleskey versus Kemp that racial bias in sentencing, even if shown through credible statistical evidence, could not be challenged under the 14th Amendment in the absence of clear evidence of conscious discriminatory intent. On its face, the case appeared to be a straightforward challenge to Georgia's death penalty scheme. Once the court's opinion was released, however, it became clear the case was about much more than the death penalty. The real issue at hand was whether, and to what extent, the Supreme Court would tolerate racial bias in the criminal justice system as a whole. The court's answer was that racial bias would be tolerated virtually to any degree, so long as no one admitted it. Warren McCleskey was a black man facing the death penalty for killing a white police officer during an armed robbery in Georgia. Represented by the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, McCleskey challenged his death sentence on the grounds that Georgia's death penalty scheme was infected with racial bias and thus violated the 14th and 8th Amendments. In support of his claim, he offered an exhaustive study of more than 2,000 murder cases in Georgia. The study was known as the Baldus Study, named after Professor David Baldus, who was its lead author. The study found that defendants charged with killing white victims received the death penalty 11 times more often than defendants charged with killing black victims. Georgia prosecutors seemed largely to blame for the disparity. They sought the death penalty in 70% of cases involving black defendants and white victims, but only 19% of cases involving white defendants and black victims. Sensitive to the fact that numerous factors besides race can influence the decision-making of prosecutors, judges, and juries, Baldus and his colleagues subjected the raw data to highly sophisticated statistical analysis to see if non-racial factors might explain the disparities. Yet even after accounting for 35 non-racial variables, the researchers found that defendants charged with killing white victims were 4.3 times more likely to receive a death sentence than defendants charged with killing blacks. Black defendants, like McCleskey, who killed white victims, had the highest chance of being sentenced to death in Georgia. The case was closely watched by criminal lawyers and civil rights lawyers nationwide. The statistical evidence of discrimination that Baldus had developed was the strongest ever presented to a court regarding race in criminal sentencing. If McCleskey's evidence wasn't enough to prove discrimination in the absence of some kind of racist utterance, what would be? By a one-vote margin, the court rejected McCleskey's claims under the 14th Amendment, insisting that unless McCleskey could prove that the prosecutor in his particular case had sought the death penalty because of race, or that the jury had imposed it for racial reasons, the statistical evidence of race discrimination in Georgia's death penalty system did not prove unequal treatment under the law. The court accepted the statistical evidence as valid, but insisted the evidence of conscious racial bias in McCleskey's individual case was necessary to prove unlawful discrimination. In the absence of such evidence, patterns of discrimination, even patterns as shocking as demonstrated by the Baldus study, did not violate the 14th Amendment. In erecting this high standard, the court knew full well that the standard could not be met absent an admission that a prosecutor or judge acted because of racial bias. The majority opinion openly acknowledged that long-standing rules generally bar litigants from obtaining discovery from the prosecution regarding charging patterns and motives, and that similar rules forbid introduction of evidence of jury deliberations even when a juror has chosen to make deliberations public. The very evidence that the court demanded in McCleskey, evidence of deliberate bias in his individual case, would almost always be unavailable and/or inadmissible due to procedural rules that shield jurors and prosecutors from scrutiny. This dilemma was of little concern to the court. It closed the courthouse doors to claims of racial bias in sentencing. There is good reason to believe that despite appearances, the McCleskey decision wasn't really about the death penalty at all. Rather, the court's opinion was driven by a desire to immunize the entire criminal justice system from claims of racial bias. The best evidence in support of this view can be found at the end of the majority opinion, where the court states that discretion plays a necessary role in the implementation of the criminal justice system, and that discrimination is an inevitable byproduct of discretion. Racial discrimination, the court seemed to suggest, was something that simply must be tolerated in the criminal justice system, provided no one admits to racial bias. The majority observed that significant racial disparities had been found in other criminal settings beyond the death penalty, and that McCleskey's case implicitly calls into question the integrity of the entire system. In the court's words, "Taken to its logical conclusion, Warren McCleskey's claim throws into serious question the principles that underlie our criminal justice system. If we accepted McCleskey's claim that racial bias has impermissibly tainted the capital sentencing decision, we could soon be faced with similar claims as to other types of penalty." The court openly worried that other actors in the criminal justice system might also face scrutiny for allegedly biased decision-making if similar claims of racial bias in the system were allowed to proceed. Driven by these concerns, the court rejected McCleskey's claim that Georgia's death penalty system violates the Eighth Amendment's ban on arbitrary punishment, framing the critical question as whether the Baldus study demonstrated a constitutionally unacceptable risk of discrimination. Its answer was no. The court deemed the risk of racial bias in Georgia's capital sentencing scheme constitutionally acceptable. Justice Brennan pointedly noted in his dissent that the court's opinion seems to suggest a fear of too much justice. Cracked up. Discriminatory sentencing in the war on drugs. Anyone who doubts the devastating impact of McCleskey versus Kemp on African American defendants throughout the criminal justice system, including those ensnared by the war on drugs, need only ask Edward Clary. 2 months after his 18th birthday, Clary was stopped and searched in the St. Louis airport because he looked like a drug courier. At the time, he was returning home from visiting some friends in California. One of them persuaded him to take some drugs back home to St. Louis. Clary had never attempted to deal drugs before, and he had no criminal record. During the search, the police found crack cocaine and promptly arrested him. He was convicted in federal court and sentenced under federal laws that punish crack offenses 100 times more severely than offenses involving powder cocaine. A conviction for the sale of 500 grams of powder cocaine triggers a 5-year mandatory sentence, while only 5 grams of crack triggers the same sentence. Because Clary had been caught with more than 50 grams of crack, less than 2 ounces, the sentencing judge believed he had no choice but to sentence him, an 18-year-old, first-time offender, to a minimum of 10 years in federal prison. Clary, like defendants in other crack cases, challenged the constitutionality of the 100-to-1 ratio. His lawyers argued that the law is arbitrary and irrational because it imposes such vastly different penalties on 2 forms of the same substance. They also argued that the law discriminates against African Americans because the majority of those charged with crimes involving crack at that time were black. Approximately 93% of convicted crack offenders were black, 5% were white, whereas powder cocaine offenders were predominantly white. Every federal appellate court to have considered these claims had rejected them on the ground that Congress, rightly or wrongly, believed that crack was more dangerous to society, a view supported by the testimony of some drug abuse experts and police officers. The fact that most of the evidence in support of any disparity had since been discredited was deemed irrelevant. What mattered was whether the law had seemed rational at the time it was adopted. Congress, the courts concluded, is free to amend the law if circumstances have changed. Courts also had rejected claims that crack sentencing laws were racially discriminatory. largely on the grounds that the Supreme Court's decision in McCleskey v. Kemp precluded such a result. In the years following McCleskey, lower courts consistently rejected claims of race discrimination in the criminal justice system, finding that gross racial disparities don't merit strict scrutiny in the absence of evidence of explicit race discrimination, the very evidence unavailable in the era of colorblindness. Judge Clyde Cahill of the Federal District of Missouri, an African-American judge assigned Clary's case, boldly challenged the prevailing view that courts are powerless to address forms of race discrimination that are not overtly hostile. Cahill declared the 100-to-1 ratio racially discriminatory in violation of the 14th Amendment, notwithstanding McCleskey. Although no admissions of racial bias or racist intent could be found in the record, Judge Cahill believed race was undeniably a factor in the crack sentencing laws and policies. He traced the history of the Get Tough movement and concluded that fear, coupled with unconscious racism, had led to a lynch mob mentality and a desire to control crime, and those deemed responsible for it, at any cost. Cahill acknowledged that many people may not believe they are motivated by discriminatory attitudes, but argued that we all have internalized fear of young black men, a fear reinforced by media imagery that has helped to create a national image of the young black male as a criminal.
Oh, criminal Gus T. Katherine Massey Book Club. Woof. Alrighty. We are done with the first chunk of the read, and then we will pick back up in the second section of the audio book once we get our discussion done. All of the fear of young black people. Anyway, let's see. The number to dial, 720-716-7300. The code 564-943 pound. Press star 61 if you would like to participate. The email, untiljustice@gmail.com. untiljustice@gmail.com. Number again, 720-716-7300. The code 564-943 pound. Press star 61 if you would like to participate. That's it. Let's see. We have a little bit more of the cracked up discriminatory sentencing in the war on drugs. Just a teaspoon of that left to finish up. We'll get to that in the second portion of the audio segment. Now, I have to get in the, what shall I call this, edits. Again, we were told at the beginning of the 10th anniversary edition preface that this is basically the same book. She used that word. Basically the same book as what originally came out in 2010. Hog wash. And I mean like hard hog wash. Okay, now we have to rewind. This is the section, the color of justice, the first, whatever you want to call it, section. It's not a chapter, I guess, subsection that we read today, where we started at. That section, it's about a page or two within the chapter or so. The paragraph, it starts, murder convictions tend to receive a tremendous amount of media attention. That's the sentence that starts the paragraph. The change begins. The change begins with the sentence, as much as a third of state prisoners are violent offenders, but that statistic can be easily misinterpreted. Okay? That's where the switcheroos start, from the first book to 2010 and even the 2012 audiobook. Massive adjustments. Okay? So I'm going to have to go back. This is 2010. And then I'll give you what the 2020 edition says. So the changes begin here. 2010 reads, as much as a third of state prisoners are violent offenders, but that statistic can be easily misinterpreted. Violent offenders tend to get longer prison sentences than non-violent offenders, and therefore comprise a much larger share of the prison population than they would if they had earlier release dates. The uncomfortable reality is that convictions for drug offenses, not violent crime, are the single most important cause of the prison boom in the United States, and people of color are convicted of drug offenses at rates out of all proportion to their drug crimes. That's in the 2010 version that we are reading. Massive edits to that one little paragraph that I just read. Maybe, what is that, about 4-5 sentences? Okay, now I'm going to go and I'm going to give you the 2010 version. Make sure I can find my place here, because so much has switched around. Okay, in fact, so much switched around. The 2010 version, it reads, I'm in the same chapter, section, whatever. In the state system, less than 3% of the new court commitments to state prison typically involve people convicted of homicide. That's the end of the paragraph, okay? Now, in the 2010 version of the book, that is not the end of the paragraph. What I just read, those 4 or 5 sentences or what have you, as much as a third of state prisoners, violent offenders, blah, 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 that's the rest of the paragraph. She deletes all of that in the 2020 version. Everything I just read, deleted. We get a brand new paragraph, and really brand new pages of text in the 2020 version. So kick back for a second. This is what you get in 2000. In fact, this is what you get in 2020. This is what's in the 2012 audiobook as well. Roughly half of the people in state prisons are classified as violent offenders, but that statistic can be easily misinterpreted. Now, I'm going to just go back and do the first sentence of what was deleted. As much as a third of state prisoners are violent offenders, but that statistic can be easily misinterpreted. That's 2010. I'm going to come back to 2020. Roughly half of the people in state prisons are classified as violent offenders, but that statistic can be easily misinterpreted. Now, which is it? And mind you, there is no footnote in either edition. Which is it? Is it as much as a third of state prisoners are violent offenders, or is it roughly half of state prisoners are violent offenders? Which is it? You don't cite where you got this statistic from. third, half, 60%. Come on. I mean, a third is not half. It's not even close. It's a sizable difference. Anything that you're talking about, 1/3 is not 1/2. Basic fractions, yes? Okay. I'm going to keep reading because I said, but I mean, that's massive. Just right off top. That's massive. Continuing. The term violent offender can apply to people who have been convicted of a wide range of crimes, from fistfights to armed robbery to rape or murder. The general public seems to imagine that our prisons are filled with rapists and murderers, but they actually account for a small minority of our nation's prison population. Equally important to understand is this: the fact that half of a state's prison population is comprised of people who are labeled violent offenders does not mean that half of the people sentenced to prison in that state have been convicted of violent crimes. This may seem counterintuitive at first, but if you pause to consider how the system actually operates, this fact becomes obvious. People who are convicted of violent crimes tend to get longer prison sentences than those who commit non-violent offenses. As a result, people who are classified as violent offenders comprise a much larger share of the prison population than they would if they had earlier release dates. A hypothetical scenario may help here. Picture in your mind a prison hallway lined with cells, 10 on each side, that are occupied by people for varying lengths of time. Imagine that each cell holds 2 people. One side of the hallway is reserved for people who have been convicted of drug or property crimes and who have relatively short sentences, 5 years or fewer. The other side of the hallway is reserved for people who have been convicted of violent crimes and sentenced to 10 years or more or life imprisonment. During a single decade, more than 100 people could cycle in and out of the cages reserved for people convicted of non-violent crimes, with the same 20 people who are locked up for violent crimes on the other side of the hallway would remain in place. At any given moment, if you were to snap a picture of that hallway, half of the people living in cages would be classified as violent offenders. But this picture would wildly distort your understanding of the population that had been sentenced to prison during the past 10 years. Although prison hallways are not segregated in this fashion, some version of this dynamic occurs in prisons across America, resulting in prisons that are half filled with people convicted of violent crimes, even though most people sentenced to prisons and jails were convicted of lesser offenses. The most important fact to keep in mind, however, is that debates about prison statistics typically ignore a key fact. Most people who are under state supervision and control are not in prison. Of the nearly 7.3 million people currently under correctional control, only 2.3 million are in prison or in jail. Footnote, and I'm just calling that out because out of everything that I just read, all these edits and changes and everything, that is the first time that I've actually hit anything that's been footnoted. Continuing. The rest are on probation or parole. More than 4 million people are on probation in the United States, roughly twice the number in prison, and only 19% of them were convicted of a violent offense. Similarly, the overwhelming majority of people on parole were convicted of non-violent crimes. Footnote, the most common offense for which people are placed on probation or parole is a drug offense, even if the analysis is limited to felonies, thus excluding extremely minor crimes and misdemeanors. Non-violent offenses predominate. Only about a quarter of felony defendants in large urban counties were charged with a violent offense in 2006. Nevertheless, politicians, law enforcement officials, and journalists routinely create the false impression that most people branded criminals have been convicted of violent crimes. They point to the current composition of state prisons as proof of this imagined fact, ignoring that sentencing practices distort our understanding of who is placed under state control and why. The lie that most people sent to prison are violent offenders is dangerous because it perpetuates the false notion that our system of mass incarceration is primarily concerned with violence and that it is well designed to keep people safe. In fact, the system is primarily concerned with the perpetual control and marginalization of the dispossessed. I have to pause for a moment just to catch my breath. The edit continues. None of this is to suggest that we ought not be concerned about violent crime, nor is it to say that we should not care about people serving time for violent offenses. We should care deeply about all people impacted, including people who live in fear of violence, people who are survivors, and those who commit violent crimes. Often these categories overlap, since nearly everyone who engages in violence first survives it. If we truly want to end violence in our communities, we must come to understand, as discussed in the final chapter, the ways in which mass incarceration increases, not decreases, violence and multiplies its harms. But at the same time, we ought not be misled by those who insist that violent crime has driven the rise of this unprecedented system of racial and social control. The uncomfortable reality is that a literal war has been waged on our most vulnerable communities, and convictions for relatively minor nonviolent offenses have propelled mass incarceration. In many states, including Colorado and Maryland, people convicted of drug offenses now constitute the single largest category of people admitted to prison. People of color are convicted of drug offenses at rates out of all proportion to their drug crimes, a fact that has greatly contributed to the emergence of a vast new racial undercast, a system of mass incarceration that governs the lives of millions of people inside and outside of prison walls. Woo! I am tired. All of that before we get back to these facts still leave some readers unsatisfied, and we get back in line with the same text, 2010. But I mean, that is a lot. I'd have to do a word count on that to see, because like I said, that's like pages. That's not no, hey, it's basically the same. Like, no, it is not. And this is like way important, because this is one of those, she took major criticisms. I don't think there were legions of people like Gus T saying, hey, the red bone deception, old Michelle Alexander didn't tell us about growing up in Ashland, racially restricted regions, and having a white parent and lying about it. Most of the criticisms, they didn't talk about that. Colorblind and your pronouns, all this, most people didn't say anything about that. Maybe no one. Many people did say, wait a minute, this heifer is lying about the number of violent offenders who are locked up. People wrote whole books and articles and really attacked her aggressively in saying she's lying about this. You know, most of the people that are locked up are about drugs and particularly state penitentiaries. And so that you start off saying as much as a third of state prisoners are violent offenders. By the time we get to 2020, roughly half of the people in state prisons are classified as violent offenders. At minimum, I'm of the opinion there should be an explanation. Were you in error the first time? Did you get slipped some bad information? Did the data change over that 10-year time period? Like, you got to give me something. It cannot be you have all of that. Edit, change and add and all this. And we get back on the hypothetical. That happened before. We get back on this hallway metaphor. I think someone said she mentioned that in the preface. Like, wait a minute. What does the data say? Because other people, they didn't break out hypotheticals and let's imagine a hallway. They didn't do all that. They just looked at the data. What does the data say? And the data says, ooh-wee, you done lied. In fact, some folks, they would just point to that, hey, man, the reason that it jumped to roughly half of the people in state prisons are classified as violent offenders is because she knew she was wrong the first time. Or what I said, this is really sloppy scholarship. I said that last week. I'm going to keep saying that, and I'm going to keep side-eyeing every last one of the lame, and I mean out of this world, retarded. That's what Fuller said. I'm looking at Michelle Alexander. You can pick one. You're a liar or you're retarded. Pick one. I'm turning to look at all the people who bragged about this book. Woo! It's C.O.W.S investors. It's C.O.W.S listeners. Woo! Michelle Alexander. Woo! Woo! Greatest book ever. Woo! End races. Woo! You are retarded. White people got you. And I mean, hey, they get all of us. But I mean, woo, this book is so lame. It is so retarded. You don't even have to be no nerd like Gus T, where you actually got to turn the Netflix off and put 2 books up. I don't ever have to do no lame crap like this. Get 2 books and put them side by side where you done told me it's the same book. You lying heifer. No, it's not. At minimum, I'm saying, hey, be an honest scholar. If you made a mistake, I make mistakes. I tell you all, hey, I made an error. My bad. I'm going to try to do better. I've done that many times on the archives and even sometimes have listeners step up to tell me, Gus T, you messing up, even when that's not the case. So y'all keep me honest, even when I ain't messing up. All that notwithstanding, WTH, man. And I mean, this is at the heart of the book. Did you mess it? Did you lie to us with all this? Did you mess up? And then, I'm telling you, we talked about this before. These metaphors, we started with hard data. You're supposed to be a scholar of jurisprudence. Did you graduate from Stanford or are you a DEI student? DEI hire. You got a DEI Stanford degree. If you did, if you messed up your scholarship, now one, that's a major pause because that's kind of core to the book. Did you mess up about something that's supposed to be the core of this whole book about drug war and math and you didn't even get your data right? I've been saying the whole time, how about you just sit down, shut up, go play with your white mom, and it's tons of books on print. We didn't need this book. It's tons of them. Maybe race soldiers needed this book. Somebody to promote white people are colorblind. Maybe they needed that, but we did not need this book to better understand prisons. Help out the Carter M. Stewart and Michelle Alexander household. Help their budget out so they can go get a little bit more discretionary spending. They can go see Jesse Owens biopic and get the extra butter on the popcorn. Take the whole family out because you know it's expensive to go to the movies now. I have to keep my eyes alert for any other changes and that's every week I have to say that this got changed, and there'll be major changes, massive changes. That I don't even think we've had one as big as this as we've been moving along in the book. This is like pages. And I'm telling you, as someone who has facilitated a book club for 14 years, I have no recollection of a book that has been changed this much. Just in 10, we've read books that are older and they edit and we got a new version, they got a new preface, and I do not ever remember us reading a book like this. Easily one of the worst ever. It might move up to be worse than 4, but I mean at minimum, it is the 4th worst book I have ever read by the scholar. Just looking at her own work, it was so lame she couldn't even stand on this work. If we weren't so retarded, we would have recognized this immediately. And again, the red bone deception. I am saying 10 toes down. If Michelle Alexander had 2 black parents, non-white people and white people would have been far less enthused about this work. Facts. The red bone deception. The number again, 720-716-7300. The code 564943 pound. Press star 61 if you would like to participate. Grab email number 1 and then nab some of the folks who dialed in as well. Email number 1. Greetings, Gus, listeners, callers. At this point in the text, I thought it might be constructive to summarize the criticisms discussed in the book club thus far. No particular order. 1. Use of colorblind in the title and throughout the text. It is deceptive and illogical for reasons that have been often discussed on the cows. For example, colorblind laws. 2. Selectively not identifying victims referenced in the text as non-white. 3. A plethora of historical inaccuracies, lies, and omissions. Just plain sloppy scholarship. More of that this week. 4. Omitting the fact that the author was raised in a racially restricted region, which is an important fact providing context for her analysis. 5. Minimizing the atrocities perpetuated against black people, e.g. the crack cocaine era. 6. Racial narrowing by focusing the so-called southern part of the U.S. as the nexus of racism, white supremacy, not Ashland, Oregon. 7. Framing poor white people as confused, duped victims as opposed to racist white supremacists. That's what she says. The bribe, the racial bribe. They got to trick and coerce white people into being racist. 8. The use of the terms such as we and our, with lots more of that this week, which in effect makes a mockery of the horrific mistreatment that black people have endured and implying that we have agency in their criminal enterprise. 9. Revisions of the text soon after the first edition, calling into question the veracity of the first edition. More of that this week, and that's something that I've said as like majorly important. I mean, at minimum, if we were just made aware of the edits, that would massively different. That would change things a lot. Like, oh, okay, she, like I said, made an error, or things changed, still learning, all of that would be acceptable. We didn't get any of that, and she doesn't even make us aware of these edits. Like I said, for a lot of folks, it would leave one with the impression that if you didn't read the first 2010 edition, if you come to the 2020 book or you get the 2012 audio book, you think, oh, wow, she is really, radical and out there, mentions COINTELPRO and all that. You wouldn't even be like, wait a minute, she didn't change. What? You wouldn't even, she could just slip all that by you. They, who, editors, whoever you want to blame for all of this. 10. Obfuscating the role of people classified as white have as the sole initiators and perpetuators of the global system of racism, white supremacy, use of terms such as unconscious bias and automatic, implying that white people are ignorant about racism, white supremacy, what it is, and how it works. Lots of people do that. 11, the plethora of metaphors throughout the text which are inaccurate and confusing when discussing the global system of racism, white supremacy. We had more of those metaphors this week, and I think this week is where we got the hallway metaphor, and I think this listener had wrote in where he had said, like, man, I think she uses that hallway metaphor a couple times, because like I said, it pops up in the preface, which we already read, and then it popped up again today in that big, massive, patch that she has in the audio book in the anniversary edition. 12, continual use of ambiguous language and terms. Conservative, progressive, liberal, allies, democracy, Americans, etc. The color of justice. Emma Faye Stewart, you are innocent. Plead guilty so you can return home to your children. You are no longer eligible for food stamps. You are about to be evicted from public housing. Once homeless, your children will be taken away from you and put in foster care. C.O.W.S guest and the author of the worst book ever, at least for now, Dorothy Roberts, her one non-bad book, Shattered Bonds. All of that certainly tainted now with her latest offering, and that it's another cow bed. Very similar reasonings for why Dorothy Roberts and Michelle Alexander cowbells, why they both have books that are the top 5 worst of all time. Lots of overlap. Lots of lying, too. So I said the same thing to her. I said, this is a very dishonest book. Very. For some of the same reasons, African Americans, particularly in the poorest neighborhoods, are subject to tactics and practices that would result in public outrage and scandal if committed in middle-class white neighborhoods. In the drug war, the enemy is racially defined. So, white people are not colorblind after all? Question. I am confused. Again, I say the exact same thing. There's so many, I think, points in this book, even just in the section that we read today, where it's, wait a minute, I thought you said this was colorblind. This doesn't seem colorblind to me. Stop lying. 3, Human Rights Watch reported in 2000 that in 7 states, African Americans constitute 80 to 90% of all drug offenders sent to prison. This is unconscious bias resulting from colorblindness? Question mark. What, then, does explain the extraordinary racial disparities in our criminal justice system? Old-fashioned racism seems out of the question. Really? Our newly conceived ethic of colorblind that our, again, early 1980s survey data indicated that 90% of whites thought black and white children should attend the same schools. So how do you explain the fact that schools and neighborhoods are just as racially restricted or more so than they were in the 1950s, which she acknowledges? And this is one is, wait a minute. Where did you go to high school? Oh, Ashland, Oregon. See, this is one where it's like, man, don't you waste my time, you lying mulatto heifer. Like, yeah, you're not supposed to name call and all that, but like, you made a lot of money and confused a lot of non-white people. You grew up in Ashland, Oregon. You grew up in Ashland, Oregon. What do you mean? Like, really, you are looking at, you're not retarded. And I would love to just name call you, you're retarded, and blah, blah, blah. You're not retarded. You grew up, went to high school, so this is not like you were a toddler, you were 5, you were 10, you were 3. You grew up in Ashland, Oregon, where you saw your dad being pulled over and terrorized by white people of Ashland, Klan and all that. You know, ain't no, oh yeah, white people, we just all live together. You know, your white family kicked your mom to the curb. That's what I mean. Like, oh, everything that he listed at the beginning, that's what I'm saying. Like, this is like appalling. I am offended. All of it, really. The patches and edits, you gonna lie to me and then sneak it in. Oh, no, I was right, brothers and sisters. All of it. I'm offended. All of it. You lame children. Ugh, the black people. All of it. I'm appalled. Ugh. And then to have people tell me, this is great. This is awesome. This really lit the fire into me to study racism. Really? To study colorblind racism? Woo! It lit a fire under me in a different way. As a matter of fact, this would be in the running for one of them there books if I did own a paperback or hardback or an index card with Michelle Alexander on it. It would be kindling for the fire, I'm going to tell you that. Think I'm going to have this hanging out on my bookshelf. Somebody say, like, oh, man, you thought Michelle Alexander was great too? No, I did not. 5, could the war on drugs operate in a discriminatory manner on such a large scale when hardly anyone advocates or engages in explicit race discrimination? See what I'm talking about? Despite the colorblind rhetoric, colorblind criminal justice system, extraordinary discretion regarding conscious and unconscious racial beliefs. As expected, the author goes to a lot of effort using convoluted explanations to explain the diabolical behavior of white people like her mother, who designed the system and gave enforcement officers all that discretion. Question: were your grandpappy and granny colorblind when they disowned your white mother? And I believe her white congregation, the church, kicked them out too. I know. That was a different time, black brother. No, I don't think it wasn't that long ago. I think her mom is still with us. So I mean, no. White people, and he added as well, white people know it is beneficial in order to keep the system going to deny that they are racist, white supremacists on those surveys. And they have done this for a long time, like even back during slavery times. Oh, I'm not no racist. Get out there, Kobe, and get that cotton, tobacco, corn. But no, we not no racists. We all believe in equality and humanity. Yes. Picking and choosing the role of discretion. Jimmy Reeves, I think he's a musician, has that name too, but I mean it's common, and Richard Campbell show in their research how media imagery surrounding cocaine changed as the practice of smoking cocaine came to be associated with poor blacks. This does not seem all that different from the centuries of denigrating black people. Oh, that word denigrating black people in the media through the newspaper articles, advertisements, the Gold Dust Twins on the washing powder box of the 1900s, lynching postcards too. 2. African Americans constituted only 15% of the current drug users in 1995, and they constitute roughly the same percentage today. Whites constituted the vast majority of drug users then and now. This is a fascinating statistic. It does not seem logical that you can lock all these black males up simply due to unconscious bias and due to unbridled discretion in a colorblind system. I mean, not accurate. That's all I can say. Yeah, and it seems like, according even to her own testimony at times, where she acknowledges that. So, yeah. 3. Decades of cognitive bias research demonstrates that both unconscious and conscious biases lead to discriminatory actions, even when an individual does not want to discriminate. Nietzsche, that there is no immaculate perception. Studies have shown that racial schemas operate not only as a part of conscious, rational deliberations. White people can't just help themselves from being racist. They are all unconscious and unaware. They are just on autopilot. Yeah, I guess. 4. Overwhelming evidence that implicit bias measures are disassociated from explicit bias measures. In other words, the fact that you may honestly believe that you are not biased against African Americans and that you may even have black friends or relatives. Hey, Miss Alexander, were your white grandparents conscious? or unconscious when they disowned your white mother? Were they racist white supremacists? They did switch around and vote for Jesse Jackson before it's all over. So, 5. Studies indicate that people become increasingly harsh when alleged criminal is darker and more stereotypically black. They are more lenient when the accused is light-skinned and appears more stereotypically white. Is this also true for how you are perceived, Miss Alexander, since you have a white parent? Great question. And again, that's why Gus T says this book is a part of why this book has been celebrated. She's not too dark. Norm Stamper said that too, right? Darker you are, like, oh yeah, boy, we gonna nigger knock you up. Closing the courthouse doors, McCluskey versus Kemp. Georgia's death penalty scheme was infected with racial bias. Even that, like, metaphor? What? They got the cooties. They got the, like, what? Racism, white supremacy is not an infection. White lives matter facts. And even when she talked about, the bias and implicit and all of that, when she tells us that, hey, even black people got some of that old implicit bias, with the shooter and all that, like, whoa. That alone, something else is operating. Given everything that's happened, black people don't have a bias where they see a white person, and even if it's just fear, like, oh my God, he's got a gun. Oh, his cell phone. I thought he was coming to get us all. I done seen so many of them. I was watching about Eric Garner before I came in today, so I just had that in my brain computer. And then they had Mark Furman on, so it was, race soldier. No. Even the black people got the bias that, oh, that's Leroy. Why is that? That's colorblind too? Come on. Court's opinion was driven by desire to immunize the entire criminal justice system from claims of racial bias. Racism, white supremacy is a system, not a virus. Those metaphors again. Racial discrimination, the court seemed to suggest, was something that simply must be tolerated in criminal justice system, provided no one admits to racial bias. Justice Brennan pointedly noted in his dissent that the court's opinion seems to suggest a fear of too much justice. The way the Supreme Court is configured provides the justices with a lot of latitude, discretion for when and how they want to practice racism, white supremacy. Must be intentional by those founding father human traffickers who organized the Supreme Court to give racists the final word on any legal dispute. Cracked up discriminatory sentencing in the war on drugs. Judge Clyde Cahill, the Federal District of Missouri, an African-American judge assigned Clary's case, boldly challenged the prevailing view that courts are powerless to address forms of race discrimination that are not overtly hostile. African-American judge Bruce Cutumloose, who also attempted to produce justice, has also been discussed on the cows. He is mentioned in the book club section in inadmissible evidence. Two different black male judges. They aren't even supposed to be on the bench. I know that Cutumloose Bruce, he had a reputation, that nickname, because he would not lock up, cage. We're just going to toss these black males away and throw away the key. He resisted doing that, and white people were not pleased. I would have to research to see if the same is true for Judge Cahill. Then this is one where I'm glad, and for this subject matter, it is important. Let us know. This is a black judge. Oh, okay, great. Very important. I've said that when we're talking about these matters, let us know the racial classification. That's a part of the evidence, so we'll have a better understanding of the people in cases that we're being presented with. Let's see. And we'll pause there for a teaspoon. I'll nab some of the folks who dialed in as well. Our caller 5962. Did you have commentary to share? I don't know. I thought the edit was so massive this week. I was like, I would have to post pictures to show people all of the changes, and then to hear the wild differences in the text, what have you. I guess you feel free to share your commentary, but caller at 5962, did you hear the massive difference between what was published in the 10th anniversary edition 2020 and what she originally gave us in 2010?
Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Yes. To answer your question, I did note the massive change, and I'm assuming it just has to be that somebody, probably white people, told her she was in error or really inaccurate, and so she just keeps changing and updating the versions over and over again to try to make it more accurate on her part. The parts I noted from this section of the reading were at the beginning of the chapter 3, where she's talking about the racial bias inherent, where she's talking about 1 in 14 black men are behind bars, compared to 1 in 106 white men. I appreciated that, she made the footnote, and so you can be able to get that comparison. But then immediately after the next paragraph, she confuses me, where she's talking about basically she's saying it appears that white people are in favor of black and white children going to the same schools, and disagree that blacks should be out of their neighborhoods and so on, as if whites are coming around to allowing black people in their spaces or wanting them in their spaces. And then she finishes with the margin of support for colorblind norms has only increased since then. I'm not aware of these colorblind norms, so she'd have to tell me what she's talking about there. The next thing that I noted was I went to search to see if Hearn, Texas was a sundown town. And the chatbot says no, that it's not a sundown town, and that actually it has a large black population. But it said it could see where I was going with that, because she fails to mention she brings up the drug suite, but she fails to mention that Mr. McGarris is the informant that assists the arresting of 15 black residents in that area during that drug sweep. And so she doesn't interrogate that at all about he is an informant that's being exploited by the police, which is another COINTELPRO practice that she could have implemented in the text that she fails to do. And then the last thing that I had was when she's talking about in fact, studies indicate that people become increasingly harsh when the criminal suspect is darker and more stereotypically black. It just made me think of the O.J. Simpson case, and if I'm not mistaken, that issue he had with Time magazine, darkening his skin on the cover. And that's all I have.
The juice. We have not forgotten you. They did darken old Renthal James. O.J. ain't killed nobody. Good riddance to you, Mark Furman. Good riddance. Died this week. We'll talk about that tomorrow. Good riddance, Mark Furman. But Renthal James, Mark Furman planting evidence. See that he going out and planting evidence and fabricating and can't even get on the stand and be truthful, lying like Michelle Alexander. But and then Johnny Cochran, I just told you I got the FBI 100 pages on him where they've been tapping his phone for years. O.J. ain't killed nobody. They ain't got no evidence. All they can do is get Time magazine, go out and make him a little darker, a little more color, just a little bit more color, Tell us, Juice did it. You didn't do. I'm sorry, Juice. You know you did not stab up nobody. Make sure I keep saying that. That's how my FOIA request began. Renthal James, innocent. That's it. Our caller, did you hear our intro today? I know sometimes people, they, got busy lives, the plantation, so they can't be right at the beginning. Were you able to hear Carter Stewart where he was talking about their offspring? They went to see the Jesse Owens biopic, and the children gave the response. They didn't want to see no Jesse Owens, because it's all about race, and that don't sound like they were about the colorblind too. The Michelle Alexander and Carter M. Stewart's offspring, but they said they didn't want to hear about no Jesse Owens, and it ain't about no racism, and I don't want to hear about no black. It's all about black this and black that and black. We don't. Did you hear that part with Carter M. Stewart, her husband?
Yes, sir, I heard that part, and I assume that's just a product of Michelle Alexander and her having her white parent.
Well, much obliged, sir. Man, and she did tell us that the white grandmother was there to help out with the children while she was writing the first round of this book. So, I mean, hey, having a white person that you share genetic material with hanging out in your household to your formative years does have an impact, and an impact on how you see white people and people classified as black. Even Jesse Owens, apparently. Much obliged, sir. Let's see. I'll nab a few of my notes in real quick before we get to the second audio segment. When all of this, she goes into so much effort, convoluted language, I think folks have said, where, hey, white people, if they are racist, they're ignorant. It's not all white people. Like, it's so much verbiage around there where she said even most Americans express horror and outrage about racial bias. What? I do not. That is not true. Like Kyle Rittenhouse, that's another. So you say, so is it a third of the prisoners are violent, or is it half? Is it most Americans, or a third, 10%? What? What? And at the end of the day, what really, we don't have Americans per Mr. Fuller, but at the end of the day, do white people express genuine horror and outrage about racism, white supremacy? Let's see. Make sure I didn't miss anything. That massive, whatever you want to call it, injection of new text. Let's see. This section where she talks about the so-called code words, because I think that's even come up earlier in the text, but when she talks about all these so-called code words, it was Nixon years and all that, she talked about that then too, but when she talks about these so-called code words where you can talk about crime, or I guess that's all you even have to say, you don't have to say more than that, just crime. We already think, oh, some dark person is out there selling drugs and raping and all that. If that's true, are we really colorblind? Use her pronouns. Are we really colorblind? Or is it just that white people, racists, are very refined and we don't have to appear racist? We don't even have to make it seem like we're directly talking about racism. We know we can just come out and give hey, we got criminals. And everybody, yeah, we got these criminals. Like, man, that it is. We have an extremely sophisticated understanding about all of this, so that we can already just tap the nose, do a wink, or and we already know. Oh, yep. Practice racism. Like, that's not colorblind. And again, she knows that Michelle Alexander is not retarded. Ashland, Oregon. Forget that. Her white parent, her white family. She is not retarded. Let's see. All the decades of research and cognitive, you don't even need none of that, man. You got your PhD in racism in Oregon. Like, come on. What it means to be white, too. Same thing. We talked about some of these court decisions. Mumia Abu Jamal, who is not mentioned in this text. That was one of the ones that I mentioned immediately, because I said, how serious are you if you are talking about all the black males who get locked up? Black Panther members like Mumia Abu-Jamal, where are all they at, who've been talking about this prison issue forever, and some of them victims have been in prison and still talking about this? How are they not mentioned? Oh, because you're not serious about this subject matter. Okay. Even when she mentions the death row case, one, they have whole studies and such that show that the dark, not just being black, but O.J. Simpson type thing, the darker you are, the more likely you are to get the death penalty. And especially if you have committed a crime against a white person. Oh man. Let's see. And even within this, where she talked about prosecutor, well, I'll get to that. When she mentioned the case of Edward Clary, privileged black male who had the less than 2 ounces, but he got the mandatory sentence, first time 10 years. When they said he looked like a drug courier, whatever that means. I thought, is that like Walter White, Breaking Bad? Or, I'm thinking what they've shown me on television. That's what I was thinking, but ignorant me. Let's see. And even when she gives all these statistics, the result was that 98.4% of those serving life sentences under the provision were black. Now, that's colorblind in a system of white supremacy racism. And in Georgia, now this is one of the southern states that you talk about, that's colorblind. That it ain't no, that's implicit bias. Nobody was trying to mess over black people, and we all love John Lewis, and we all go to the King Center as much as we can. No racists in Georgia. Isn't that the state where they had the Confederate flag on the state for the long line? 98% seems a lot for you to tell me we ain't do this on purpose. This was just, maybe the black folk, we ain't got enough Johnny Cochrans for the black people down here. Maybe that's what it is. Any hoodles. Oh yeah, we get to the jury part this time around. So I get to the prosecutors and all that. We even get back to Texas. I will pause here so we can return to the text or audiobook. Folks have additional thoughts, just jot them down. We should have ample time for everyone to speak once we are done. We will get back to it. Michelle Alexander Cowbell, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration. Even this whole time I've been talking about people that are not included in the book. You could add Neely Fuller Jr. and Dr. Welsing to that list as well. Both of them, even though they didn't write books specifically, exclusively about incarceration, Fuller spent decades talking about the prison system, and I would say more accurately than Michelle Alexander. New terminology and all of that, greater confinement, everything. Dr. Welsing as well. They could have been mentioned, along with Angela Davis, Mumia Abu-Jamal. That's what I'm saying. There's so many black people who have done really serious and sincere work about prisons decades before Michelle Alexander. For you to come and do slipshod work at best, if not the red bone deception. Katherine, Massey Book Club, audio segment number 2, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness, a book we did not need. Audio segment 2.
The presumption of innocence is now a legal myth, he declared. The 100-to-1 ratio, coupled with mandatory minimum sentencing provided by federal statute, has created a situation that reeks with inhumanity and injustice. If young white males were being incarcerated at the same rate as young black males, the statute would have been amended long ago. Judge Cahill sentenced Clary as if the drug he had carried home had been powder cocaine. The sentence imposed was 4 years in prison. Clary served his term and was released. The prosecution appealed Clary's case to the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals, which reversed Judge Cahill in a unanimous opinion, finding that the case was not even close. In the court's view, there was no credible evidence that the crack penalties were motivated by any conscious racial bigotry, as required by McCleskey v. Kemp. The court remanded the case back to the district court for resentencing. Clary, now married and a father, was ordered back to prison to complete his 10-year term. Few challenges to sentencing schemes, patterns, or results have been brought since McCleskey, for the exercise is plainly futile. Yet in 1995, a few brave souls challenged the implementation of Georgia's 2 strikes and you're out sentencing scheme, which imposes life imprisonment for a second drug offense. Georgia's district attorneys, who have unbridled discretion to decide whether to seek this harsh penalty, had invoked it against only 1% of white defendants facing a second drug conviction, but against 16% of black defendants. The result was that 98.4% of those serving life sentences under the provision were black. The Georgia Supreme Court ruled, by a 4-3 vote, that the stark racial disparity presented a threshold case of discrimination and required the prosecutors to offer a race-neutral explanation for the results. Rather than offer a justification, however, the Georgia Attorney General filed a petition for rehearing, signed by every one of the state's 46 district attorneys, all of whom were white. The petition argued that the court's decision was a dire mistake. If the decision were allowed to stand and prosecutors were compelled to explain gross racial disparities such as the ones at issue, it would be a substantial step toward invalidating the death penalty and would paralyze the criminal justice system. Apparently because severe and inexplicable racial disparities pervaded the system as a whole. 13 days later, the Georgia Supreme Court reversed itself, holding that the fact that 98.4% of the defendants selected to receive life sentences for repeat drug offenses were black required no justification. The court's new decision relied almost exclusively on McCleskey v. Kemp. To date, not a single successful challenge has ever been made to racial bias in sentencing under McCleskey v. Kemp anywhere in the United States. Charging ahead, Armstrong v. United States. If sentencing were the only stage of the criminal justice process in which racial biases were allowed to flourish, it would be a tragedy of gargantuan proportions. Thousands of people have had years of their lives wasted in prison, years they would have been free if they had been white. Some, like McCleskey, have been killed because of the influence of race in the death penalty. Sentencing, however, is not the end, but just the beginning. As we shall see, the legal rules governing prosecutions, like those that govern sentencing decisions, maximize rather than minimize racial bias in the drug war. The Supreme Court has gone to great lengths to ensure that prosecutors are free to exercise their discretion in any manner they choose, and it has closed the courthouse doors to claims of racial bias. As discussed in Chapter 2, no one has more power in the criminal justice system than prosecutors. Few rules constrain the exercise of prosecutorial discretion. The prosecutor is free to dismiss a case for any reason or no reason at all, regardless of the strength of the evidence. The prosecutor is also free to file more charges against a defendant than can realistically be proven in court, so long as probable cause arguably exists. Whether a good plea deal is offered to a defendant is entirely up to the prosecutor, and if the mood strikes, the prosecutor can transfer drug defendants to the federal system, where the penalties are far more severe. Juveniles, for their part, can be transferred to adult court, where they can be sent to adult prison. Angela J. Davis, in her authoritative study, Arbitrary Justice, The Power of the American Prosecutor, observes that the most remarkable feature of these important, sometimes life-and-death decisions is that they are totally discretionary and virtually unreviewable. Most prosecutors' offices lack any manual or guidebook advising prosecutors how to make discretionary decisions. Even the American Bar Association's standards of practice for prosecutors are purely aspirational. No prosecutor is required to follow the standards or even consider them. Christopher Lee Armstrong learned the hard way that the Supreme Court has little interest in ensuring that prosecutors exercise their extraordinary discretion in a manner that is fair and non-discriminatory. He, along with 4 of his companions, was staying at a Los Angeles motel in April 1992 when federal and state agents on a joint drug crime task force raided their room and arrested them on federal drug charges, conspiracy to distribute more than 50 grams of crack cocaine. The federal public defenders assigned to Armstrong's case were disturbed by the fact that Armstrong and his friends had something in common with every other crack defendant their office had represented during the past year. They were all black. In fact, of the 53 crack cases their office had handled over the prior 3 years, 48 defendants were black, 5 were Hispanic, and not a single one was white. Armstrong's lawyers found it puzzling that no white crack offenders had been charged, given that most crack offenders are white. They suspected that whites were being diverted by federal prosecutors to the state system, where the penalties for crack offenses were far less severe. The only way to prove this, though, would be to gain access to the prosecutor's records and find out just how many white defendants were transferred to the state system and why. Armstrong's lawyers thus filed a motion asking the district court for discovery of their prosecutors' files to support their claim of selective prosecution under the 14th Amendment. Nearly 100 years earlier, in a case called C.O.W.S. versus Hopkins, the Supreme Court had recognized that racially selective enforcement violates equal protection of the laws. In that case, decided in 1886, the court unanimously overturned convictions of 2 Chinese men who were operating laundries without a license. San Francisco had denied licenses to all Chinese applicants, but granted licenses to all but one of the non-Chinese laundry operators who applied. Law enforcement arrested more than 100 people for operating laundries without licenses, and every one of the arrestees was Chinese. Overturning C.O.W.S.'s conviction, the Supreme Court declared in a widely quoted passage, "Though the law itself be fair on its face and impartial in appearance, yet, if it is applied and administered by public authority with an evil eye and an unequal hand, so as practically to make unjust and illegal discriminations between persons in similar circumstances, the denial of equal justice is still within the prohibition of the Constitution." Armstrong's lawyers sought to prove that, like the law at issue in C.O.W.S., federal crack laws were fair on their face and impartial in their appearance, but were selectively enforced in a racially discriminatory manner. In support of their claim that Armstrong should, at the very least, be entitled to discovery, Armstrong's lawyers offered 2 sworn affidavits. One was from a halfway house intake coordinator who testified that, in his experience treating crack addicts, whites and blacks dealt and used the drugs in similar proportions. The other affidavit was from a defense attorney who had extensive experience in state prosecutions. He testified that non-black defendants were routinely prosecuted in state rather than federal court. Arguably, the best evidence in support of Armstrong's claim came from the government, which submitted a list of more than 2,000 people charged with federal crack cocaine violations over a 3-year period, all but 11 of whom were black. None were white. the district court ruled that the evidence presented was sufficient to justify discovery for the purposes of determining whether the allegations of selective enforcement were valid. The prosecutors, however, refused to release any records and appealed the issue all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. In May 1996, the Supreme Court reversed. As in McCluskey, the court did not question the accuracy of the evidence submitted, but ruled that because Armstrong failed to identify any similarly situated white defendants who should have been charged in federal court but were not, he wasn't entitled even to discovery on his selective prosecution claim. With no trace of irony, the court demanded that Armstrong produce in advance the very thing he sought in discovery: information regarding white defendants who should have been charged in federal court. That information, of course, was in the prosecution's possession and control, which is why Armstrong filed a discovery motion in the first place. As a result of the Armstrong decision, defendants who suspect racial bias on the part of prosecutors are trapped in a classic catch-22. In order to state a claim of selective prosecution, they are required to offer in advance the very evidence that generally can be obtained only through discovery of the prosecutor's files. The court justified this insurmountable hurdle on the grounds that considerable deference is owed the exercise of prosecutorial discretion. Unless evidence of conscious, intentional bias on the part of the prosecutor could be produced, the court would not allow any inquiry into the reasons for or causes of apparent racial disparities in prosecutorial decision-making. Again, the courthouse doors were closed, for all practical purposes, to claims of racial bias in the administration of the criminal justice system. Immunizing prosecutors from claims of racial bias and failing to impose any meaningful check on the exercise of their discretion in charging, plea bargaining, transferring cases, and sentencing has created an environment in which conscious and unconscious biases are allowed to flourish. Numerous studies have shown that prosecutors interpret and respond to identical criminal activity differently based on the race of the offender. One widely cited study was conducted by the San Jose Mercury News. The study reviewed 700,000 criminal cases that were matched by crime and criminal history of the defendant. The analysis revealed that similarly situated whites were far more successful than African Americans and Latinos in the plea bargaining process. In fact, at virtually every stage of pretrial negotiation, whites are more successful than non-whites. The most comprehensive studies of racial bias in the exercise of prosecutorial and judicial discretion involve the treatment of juveniles. These studies have shown that youth of color are more likely to be arrested, detained, formally charged, transferred to adult court, and confined to secure residential facilities than their white counterparts. A report in 2000 observed that among youth who have never been sent to a juvenile prison before, African Americans were more than 6 times as likely as whites to be sentenced to prison for identical crimes. A study sponsored by the U.S. Justice Department and several of the nation's leading foundations, published in 2007, found that the impact of the biased treatment is magnified with each additional step into the criminal justice system. African American youth account for 16% of all youth, 28% of all juvenile arrests, 35% of the youth waived to adult criminal court, and 58% of youth admitted to state adult prison. A major reason for these disparities is unconscious and conscious racial biases infecting decision-making. In the state of Washington, for example, a review of juvenile sentencing reports found that prosecutors routinely described black and white offenders differently. Blacks committed crimes because of internal personality flaws, such as disrespect. Whites did so because of external conditions, such as family conflict. The risk that prosecutorial discretion will be racially biased is especially acute in the drug enforcement context, where virtually identical behavior is susceptible to a wide variety of interpretations and responses, and the media imagery and political discourse has been so thoroughly racialized. Whether a kid is perceived as a dangerous drug-dealing thug or instead is viewed as a good kid who was merely experimenting with drugs and selling to a few of his friends has to do with the ways in which information about illegal drug activity is processed and interpreted in a social climate in which drug dealing is racially defined. As a former U.S. attorney explained, "I had an assistant U.S. attorney who wanted to drop the gun charge against the defendant in a case in which there were no extenuating circumstances. I asked, 'Why do you want to drop the gun defense?' And he said, 'He's a rural guy and grew up on a farm. The gun he had with him was a rifle. He's a good old boy, and all good old boys have rifles, and it's not like he was a gun-toting drug dealer.' But he was a gun-toting drug dealer, exactly." The decision in Armstrong effectively shields this type of biased decision-making from judicial scrutiny for racial bias. Prosecutors are well aware that the exercise of their discretion is unchecked, provided no explicitly racist remarks are made, as it is next to impossible for defendants to prove racial bias. It is difficult to imagine a system better designed to ensure that racial biases and stereotypes are given free rein, while at the same time appearing on the surface to be colorblind, than the one devised by the U.S. Supreme Court. In defense of the all-white jury, Perkett versus Elm. The rules governing jury selection provide yet another illustration of the court's complete abdication of its responsibility to guarantee racial minorities equal treatment under the law. In 1985, in Batson versus Kentucky, the court held that the 14th Amendment prohibits prosecutors from discriminating on the basis of race when selecting juries, a ruling held as an important safeguard against all-white juries locking up African Americans based on racial biases and stereotypes. Prior to Batson, prosecutors had been allowed to strike blacks from juries, provided they didn't always strike black jurors. The Supreme Court had ruled in 1965 in Swain versus Alabama that an equal protection claim would arise only if a defendant could prove that a prosecutor struck African American jurors in every case, regardless of the crime involved or regardless of the races of the defendant or the victim. 2 decades later, in Batson, the Supreme Court reversed course, a nod to the newly minted public consensus that explicit race discrimination is an affront to American values. Almost immediately after Batson was decided, however, it became readily apparent that prosecutors had no difficulty circumventing the formal requirements of colorblindness in jury selection by means of a form of subterfuge the court would come to accept, if not endorse. The history of race discrimination in jury selection dates back to slavery. Until 1860, no black person had ever sat on a jury in the United States. During the Reconstruction era, African Americans began to serve on juries in the South for the first time. The all-white jury promptly returned, however, when Democratic conservatives sought to redeem the South by stripping blacks of their right to vote and their right to serve on juries. In 1880, the Supreme Court intervened, striking down a West Virginia statute that expressly reserved jury service to white men. Citing the recently enacted 14th Amendment, the court declared that the exclusion of blacks from jury service was practically a brand upon them, affixed by law, an assertion of their inferiority, and a stimulant to that race prejudice which is an impediment to equal justice. The court asked, "How can it be maintained that compelling a colored man to submit to a trial for his life by a jury drawn from a panel from which the state has expressly excluded every man of his race, because of his color alone, however well qualified in other respects, is not a denial to him of equal protection?" For all its bluster, the court offered no meaningful protection against jury discrimination in the years that followed. As legal scholar Benno Schmidt has observed, from the end of Reconstruction through the New Deal, the systematic exclusion of black men from Southern juries was about as plain as any legal discrimination could be, short of proclamation in state statutes or confession by state officials. The Supreme Court repeatedly upheld convictions of black defendants by all white juries in situations where exclusion of black jurors was obvious. The only case in which the court overturned a conviction on the grounds of discrimination in jury selection was Neal v. Delaware, a case decided in 1935. State law in Delaware once had explicitly restricted jury service to white men, and no colored citizen had ever been summoned as a juror. The Delaware Supreme Court had rejected Neal's equal protection claim on the grounds that the great body of black men residing in this state are utterly unqualified for jury service by want of intelligence, experience, or moral integrity. The Supreme Court reversed. Clearly, what offended the U.S. Supreme Court was not the exclusion of blacks from jury service per se, but rather doing so openly and explicitly. That orientation continues to hold today. Notwithstanding Batson's formal prohibition on race discrimination in jury selection, the Supreme Court and lower federal courts have tolerated all but the most egregious examples of racial bias in jury selection. Miller L. v. Cockrell was such a case. That case involved a jury selection manual that sanctioned race-based selection. The court noted that it was unclear whether the official policy of race-based exclusion was still in effect, but the prosecution did in fact exclude 10 of 11 black jurors, in part by employing an unusual practice of jury shuffling that reduced the number of black jurors. The prosecution also engaged in desperate questioning of jurors based on race, practices that seemed linked to the jury selection manual. This was a highly unusual case. In typical cases, there are no official policies authorizing race discrimination, and jury selection still lurking around, arguably in effect. Normally, the discrimination is obvious yet unstated, and the systematic exclusion of black jurors continues largely unabated through use of the preemptory strike. Preemptory strikes have long been controversial. Both prosecutors and defense attorneys are permitted to strike preemptorily jurors they don't like. That is, people they believe will not respond favorably to the evidence or witnesses they intend to present at trial. In theory, preemptory strikes may increase the fairness of the proceeding by eliminating jurors who may be biased, but whose biases cannot be demonstrated convincingly to a judge. In practice, however, preemptory challenges are notoriously discriminatory. Lawyers typically have little information about potential jurors, so their decisions to strike individual jurors tend to be based on nothing more than stereotypes, prejudices, and hunches. Achieving an all-white jury, or nearly all-white jury, is easy in most jurisdictions because relatively few racial minorities are included in the jury pool. Potential jurors are typically called for service based on the list of registered voters or Department of Motor Vehicle lists, sources that contain disproportionately fewer people of color, because people of color are significantly less likely to own cars or register to vote. Making matters worse, 31 states and the federal government subscribe to the practice of lifetime felon exclusion from juries. As a result, about 30% of black men are automatically banned from jury service for life. Accordingly, no more than a handful of strikes are necessary in many cases to eliminate all or nearly all black jurors. The practice of systematically excluding black jurors has not been halted by Batson. The only thing that has changed is that prosecutors must come up with a race-neutral excuse for the strikes, an exceedingly easy task. In fact, One comprehensive study reviewed all published decisions involving Batson challenges from 1986 to 1992 and concluded that prosecutors almost never fail to successfully craft acceptable race-neutral explanations to justify striking black jurors. Courts accept explanations that jurors are too young, too old, too conservative, too liberal, too comfortable, or too uncomfortable. Clothing is also a favorite reason. Jurors have been stricken for wearing hats or sunglasses. Even explanations that might correlate with race, such as lack of education, unemployment, poverty, being single, living in the same neighborhood as the defendant, or prior involvement with the criminal justice system, have all been accepted as perfectly good, non-pretextual excuses for striking African Americans from juries. As Professor Sherry Lynn Johnson once remarked, if prosecutors exist who cannot create a racially neutral reason for discriminating on the basis of race, bar exams are too easy.
Katherine Massey Book Club, Context of White Supremacy. We will pick it back up next Friday, 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. If you have commentary to share, the number 720-716-7300. The code 564943 pound. Press star 61 if you would like to participate. The email untiljustice@gmail.com. I will finish up the email I was reading last time. He got a little bit further than we did. I can complete, let's see. 1, the Supreme Court has gone to great lengths to ensure that prosecutors are free to exercise their discretion. Again, the courthouse doors were closed, immunizing prosecutors from claims of racial bias. I do want to say, Gus T, for years, I am not a scholar of jurisprudence. I never even thought of law school, but I have talked about the role of discretion in criminal law and the way that black people are prosecuted for years. We've had our guest and talked about it. That, I mean, wow, it pops up in a lot of other circumstances as well. But for criminal law enforcement, discretion, man, any hoodles. Lost my place. Okay. This entire text is an excellent illustration of the Voltron effect. The prime directive was voiced by the various presidents. The legislators aligned and codified the laws with the intended goal. Enforcement officials carried out the laws. Local judges, prosecutors, and defense attorneys facilitated the process. The Supreme Court, being the final word, ended any effort by defendants to produce justice, and the end result is greater confinement. It's not any doors closing. It's not unconscious bias, and it's not colorblind system of justice. It's not a virus. It's the Voltron effect working to perfection. 2, the most comprehensive studies of racial bias in the exercise of prosecutorial and judicial discretion involve the treatment of juveniles. These studies have shown that youth of color are more likely to be arrested, detained, formally charged, transferred to adult court, and confined to secure residential facilities than their white counterparts. Reason for these disparities is unconscious and conscious racial bias. Racist white supremacists study everything in order to perfect ways of practicing racism as opposed to producing justice. White people are not ignorant about racism. And I even thought it was important having the unconscious first. It's not even alphabetical. If it was alphabetical, it'd be conscious bias, conscious and unconscious bias, right? In defense of the all-white jury, Perkett v. Elm, Rules governing jury selection provide yet another illustration of the court's complete abdication of its responsibility to guarantee racial minorities equal treatment under the law. See Cal's book club selection, The Echo from Dealey Plaza by Abraham Bolden. In the text, lone black juror on one of his trials courageously held out Alice Hightower. I remember that one. And hey, that's why they don't want no black people on the jury. In fact, it even reminded me, Henry Wade. Most people talk about him related to the Roe v. Wade case, but Henry Wade was the prosecutor in Dallas for Lee Harvey Oswald, if we want to go JFK. But if we pull it more forward, he's deceased now, but if we pull it a little bit closer to our time and related to the context of this book, Henry Wade, as a prosecuting attorney, he literally had a code book where it was, this is the way we make sure we get all white juries. He literally would tell all the prosecutors that he trained, and this went on for years, no niggas, no spics. We want all white juries. And I think they had one non-white prosecutor on the staff, and he said that I think he was the only one who did not abide by that code, racist code, that we're only going to have white jurors. And in addition, we have these all-white juries. We just go out and grab black males and just lock them up for anything, make up crimes, and whatever we want to say to the judge, jury, whatever. That's what we can do. System of white supremacy, racism. I was going to play an audio segment because they got whole documentaries that came out like years before this book was published, talking about that in great detail. Got all these black males that they lied on and said that you robbed KFC and all this old nonsense and gave them all these old bogus years. And then, oh, that's just what we do. We just like colorblind. Let's see. Email number 2. Hi, Gus, Cal's audience. I hadn't paid full attention to the book's subtitle, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. Gus T said, hey, this one, you can judge a book by the cover. When I stopped and read the full title, I said, oh, man, I got to pull my pant legs up because this is going to be a lot of deep BS and confusion, and it has been. She continues. I asked the chatbot if Mrs. Alexander defined, well, her husband is Carter M. Stewart, so I don't know. Is she still Mrs. Alexander? I asked the chatbot if Mrs. Alexander defined exactly the age of colorblindness began. The chatbot said no, and essentially that she doesn't need to because her theory is conceptual, not a calendar period. Chatbot said that the theory is an ideology, legal framework, and political strategy, might even be a metaphor. The explanation didn't work for me. None of those things, particularly the legal framework and political strategy, are abstract theories. So I pushed back at the chatbot's response, stating that the era has to be linked to a period in time. If not, it's flawed. Chatbot did not back down. It said not only is it not a flaw, it is necessary to frame it as ideological, legal, and political precisely because it isn't a calendar-bounded era. It then gave examples of other eras that are not time-bound. Example, post... That is hilarious. They just go from slop to slop. The post-racial era, I'm not even sure what the time frames are. When are the time frames for the post-racial era? Are we still in the post-racial era right now? The civil rights era, I don't know the time frames for that either. When did that start? When did it end? Okay. Civil rights era, neoliberal. What? What is it? My head hurts. My head hurts. I don't even know what that is. You got me on that one. The neoliberal era and the long Reconstruction era. That was short. That was real quick. All linked to periods of time, if you ask me, but I wasn't interested in arguing that point with the chat bot.
it did state that she does anchor her theory in the example that after the collapse of Jim Crow, but that if the era is conceptual, then then its boundaries are interpretive, not chronological, and that by not linking it to a specific date, she is in fact avoiding making a flaw in her theory. I pushed back again. I asked the chatbot whether the ideology, political, and legal theory that defines the era needs to be underpinned by facts, specifically when politics and law were implemented in a colorblind way. The chatbot started to back away from its defense of this nonsense. It said this is the right pressure test to apply to Mrs. Alexander's framework. 1, it's not a flaw that the era isn't date bounded. Many powerful analytical errors in sociology and history, the neoliberal, are defined by systems of power, not by specific start dates. 2, what matters is empirical grounding. Well, this is not well grounded empirically at all because it shifts and she got to edit and patch and all the rest of it. Ain't nothing solid there. For her argument to hold, Alexander must show colorblind ideology existed, colorblind politics operated. I think she gets an F there. Colorblind law was implemented in a way that is historically identifiable. I mean, the second one, I say no. Colorblind politics operated. I don't think, I mean, if you're just showing black people getting locked up and white people and white people refine their language so that they know they can talk about this in a way that nobody can say that we said nigger or anything like that. That is not, at least in my view, evidence of colorblind politics in operation. 3, the real critique is different. The question isn't why no date. The real scholarly tension is whether ideology, law, and politics aligned coherently enough to justify calling it a unified era. Some scholars argue the alignment was uneven. Her framing still works conceptually. Alexander is defining an era by a configuration of power, not a timeline. This is standard in critical race theory and sociology. I didn't think she was a sociologist. Maybe 5, the strongest critique you can make, she lies. You can argue that she identifies important trends but does not fully prove them from a single coherent simultaneous regime. That's the sharpest methodological challenge. I disagree. There's a lot in the response that I could argue with, but fundamentally the point is made. There's no evidence of a colorblind era, ideologically, legally, or politically. Michelle Alexander has a Stanford education and legal credentials from Harvard. That's why I said, now, I mean, I guess you could say she's a DEI student for both. You could say that. Some people have said that. Not for her specifically, but, in general about us. But, I mean, in my view, man, if I'm Harvard or somebody, I'm embarrassed. Don't tell them you went to, just put all that on Stanford. Just tell them, yeah, you went to Stanford and, yeah, they got problems out in Silicon Valley, so whatever. But, yeah, don't put that on Harvard. That's what I'd be saying. Man, we didn't have nothing to do with this foolishness unless we are about racism, white supremacy. And then it's, oh, yeah, we wanted to confuse them niggers, and we got them, boy. They out there, that old Michelle. They don't know. Is it a third of the people in prison are violent offenders? Is it half? Who knows? Who they colorblind? And who knows? A+. Did exactly what it was supposed to. The email again, untiljustice@gmail.com. I didn't have my experience when I've shared, I shared that massive edit with the chatbot. It did not say oh man, Michelle still wrote something cool and blah, blah, blah. I said, wow, that is the red bone deception, right? Because I mean, that is, you got the receipts right there. That's so much added footage and all the rest. And the chatbot went into detail with the amount of criticism she faced, where people read this and said, "Hey, man, I think you got some of your facts wrong. I think you done misinformed us, man." Any hoodles. Let's see. Folks have commentary. The email again, untiljustice@gmail.com. The number 720-716-7300. The code 564943 pound. Press star 61 if you would like to participate. Much obliged to all the folks who wrote in as we've been chugging along. Let's see. Our caller at 5962 should be with us. If you have commentary, proceed.
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to this one part earlier in the text when she's talking about picking and choosing the role of discretion. I noted that when she talks about how the reason is this, that drug law enforcement is unlike most other types of law enforcement, and then she briefly describes that because drug laws are consensual activity, that nobody has any incentive to basically call the police on someone else. I noted that the police don't need a reason. If they already believe that Black people are on drugs, crackheads, whatever the case may be, then they can just at will stop and frisk anytime they want to. And so when I put that in the chat box to just try to think it through, it talked about the myth of the objective trigger and the flaw in setting up her language in that manner. Basically makes it so that she implies that if a drug war didn't exist, policing would naturally default to a fair, reactive, and victim-driven model. And she ignores that the state has always used proactive, aggressive containment strategies against Black people, whether they're hunting for runaway slaves, or they're enforcing Black codes, or stopping and frisking young males. And that's all I have.
Much obliged, sir. I think that we have raised this criticism before. I think it was even around that term bribe that I mentioned earlier today, and we talked about it earlier in the session, where she was saying that the poor whites, that they accept the racial bribe. And we were saying that when you use that term, which she uses repeatedly in this book, bribe, white people are bribed to be racist, that it makes it seem like the system is more or less just, and it's certainly not, the default is not racist, and that upstanding humanitarian white people, you kind of have to, cajole them a little bit, twist their arm a little bit to get them to practice racism. And that is, are you serious? And even the whole war on drugs gambit, I've said consistently, white people have been locking Black people up for forever. The war on Black people has been the entirety of the system of white supremacy racism. Black Panther Party, they were talking about all of the, saying everything that she laid out, especially that we heard in the second portion about all white juries and all that. The Black Panther Party talked about this 60 years ago, talking about all Black people, all Black males in particular, should be released from prison. They have not had a just constitutional trial by their peers, all white juries and all the rest. They talked about all of this in detail to just ignore all of that and or to make it seem like, hey, if we just didn't have that, because I think some other people came to the same conclusion, the way that she writes this, it makes it seem like, hey, if we didn't have the drug war, things, we'd be in a way, better position. No, we would just have some other form of white supremacy racism and locking Black males up. Let's see. The much obliged, good sir. I will nab a few of my tidbit notes from the second audio section that we read. I did note immediately the Black judge, Judge Cahill, his decision was immediately reversed by more powerful white people, that you're not going to, try and weasel out this old Clary Black male from his comeuppance, getting his correct punishment. And so they reversed all that. White people have more power. We are in charge. Let's see. when she talks about the section where all of the Georgia attorneys, or I don't know if it was all of them, but a massive number of the Georgia attorneys, they filed a petition to support that, hey, we can't have people challenging our ability to have discretion against or as we practice law. I thought that was important too, and even reminded me, this is not colorblind. Like when white people see that their system is being challenged or attacked, even Judge Cahill right here, where he says, no, I'm not going to give this young black dude, first-time offender, I'm not going to give him a big sentence. Other white people see that, they respond. What? What is this nigger doing? Oh, no, that's not the way it's supposed to. And they go in and overturn it. Like, again, that's not colorblind either. That's white people responding to make sure the system works the way that they want it to. Let's see. Oh, yeah, I got it right there. The Georgia Attorney General filed a petition for rehearing signed by every one of the state's 46 district attorneys, all of whom were white. That's an important one to get the racial classification. And I mean, just how is that? And I suspect that's not just confined to the South, where the preponderance of district attorneys and prosecuting attorneys, they are white. And I'm not going to say white dudes, because I saw some white female prosecuting attorneys. I have seen some in the courtrooms I have sat in the past 12 months. Shout to Sade C. Robinson. Yeah, I didn't see all white dudes. I saw white females sitting at the prosecuting table. I didn't see no black people. Let's see. They were on the other side of the courtroom, you know. Let's see. When she says legal rules governing prosecutions like those that govern sentencing decisions maximize rather than minimize racial bias in the drug war, I don't think that is an accident, coincidence. I mean, as intended. The Supreme Court has gone to great lengths to ensure that prosecutors are free to exercise their discretion in any manner they choose. I don't think that's an accident either. The part where she says most prosecutors' offices lack any manual or guidebook advising prosecutors how to make discretionary decisions. I already told you that is not true. Henry Wade in Texas, he did have a manual advising prosecutors how to proceed, and it was to practice racism, no Negro jurors. And I'm just putting that out again because this was known about Mr. Wade, who was a very popular, I mean, he was in the Dallas area, Dallas, Texas area, so that's kind of a metropolitan area. And then he's connected with all these famous cases, JFK assassination, Roe v. Wade, abortion. They're documentaries about how they operated this prosecutorial office in Texas. This is one that easily could have been cited in the book in terms of them having a manual, and it is a manual to practice racism, not to practice justice. It's a code book, if you will, that was in effect for years, decades, really. And to do exactly what she said, target black males. And he was prosecuted when JFK was assassinated. So, I mean, they could have been doing this way before. That would super predate the war on drugs, right? Let's see. They go through and they look at the cases for who is going to be in, even the discretion for where we're going to prosecute. Are we going to move your case to federal court, where it's going to be steeper penalties for your drug violations? Are we going to, give you an opportunity, counseling, all that, keep it in state court, all that? Prosecutors have all that discretion, and white prosecutors, even I do note the geographical bias. I suspect she could have moved this up to Maine, Massey, hey, Oregon. I know Chicago is coming, but I mean, Wisconsin, Jesus Christ, she couldn't have done this for Milwaukee. All this, Texas here and Georgia here. She brought up Texas before. I'm not saying that. I mean, obviously, these are examples of racism for sure. But even that's kind of lame too. Like it would just, and that was mentioned, one of the listeners, it would give the impression that all the racist officers and racist carceral practices are in the South. Come on, stop lying. That's the whole system. That's the whole system. South Africa, Norway, Massachusetts. Hey, Shawshank Redemption is set in Maine. Red. Let's see, and that's the convict labor system there too. See, in Shawshank. Let's see. She says the other affidavit was from a defense attorney who had extensive experience in state prosecutions. He testified that non-black defendants were routinely prosecuted in state rather than federal court. Now you said non-black. Black get us, so you had black get back. That's like. And then we get here, everybody who is not black, we not give you no fed time. We'll take it easy on it. We'll see if we can get you a drug treatment program, and we don't give you a strike this time. We'll see if you can straighten up and fly right. That's for all of the non-black people. So even some of the people that are not white, they can slip it. Hey, maybe Michelle Alexander, maybe that's where they would count her at, white parent and all. Let's see. Even I thought that was important too, just to clarify. See, none of this is colorblind to me. You can pretend I'm retarded, or I am the one that's blind and I can't see, but you can't tell me that they submit a list of more than 2,000 people, not 200, not 20, 2,000 people for federal crack cocaine violations over a 3-year period. None of them are white. None of them, and even only 11 of them are non-white, non-black. Geez, now, did you get some super dark Latinos or something? See, we got one Cambodian in here and Laotian, and I mean, come on. That's colorblind. 2,000. If my math is accurate, out of 11, so what is that? 1,989. That has got to be like 99%. You're going to tell me, well, that's just accent with colorblind. Come on, man. Let's see. And then the prosecutors also have the power to withhold the information about the white defendants. What was so special about their case? Why were they remanded to state court? Leroy, Jamal, Devontae, you're going to throw all of them over for Fed time. What was the difference in we can't show you all that. That is standard operating procedure. White people have all of the information, and you just got to sit around and guess, hope, wait. Maybe one day they'll share or not. Let's see. I already said when she says the major reason for these disparities is unconscious and conscious bias. That's another one, in my view, where her deception and her white genetic or her genetic tether to racist white supremacists, it's not even alphabetical. And this is consistent. They will say unconscious and conscious bias, unconscious and conscious bias. Alphabetical is normally how it goes. Why is the emphasis? We got to start out unconscious. They didn't know. They weren't aware. They didn't mean to do this. They got black friends. They voted for Obama. They're not racist. It's not deliberate. Stop lying. Let's see. when she says 2 decades later, this is in defense of the all-white jury, 2 decades later in Baston, the Supreme Court reversed course, a nod to the newly minted public consensus that explicit race discrimination in effort to is an affront to American values. I don't know what American values are. I'm reminded of Dr. Webb saying, I am race, the anagram from the word America, but like she consistently says this, and it's a total lie. If this were the case, and especially if this is in the so-called colorblind era, how does Ashland, Oregon exist? There is no new public consensus that we're not racist and all that. Ashland would not, and certainly it would not have existed as it was when she was going to school there. Like, what are you even talking about? Come on, man, stop lying. Let's see. Oh, and the strikes for the jurors. This reminded me so much of Milwaukee as well, where, that was one of the court cases where I was at, and they only had 2 black people on the jury. That's one in Milwaukee where they have all this paperwork and how they deliberately don't have no black people on juries there for these criminal trials and such. Now they said and she mentioned in the book, they get the jury pool selection from the driver's license, and it said disproportionately fewer black people own vehicles, so I guess they don't get a driver's license either. But man, there are ways where you could do your jury selection that are not contingent on driver's license. I mean, you could pick a whole lot of ways where this could be done, legal, legit, and you would get a much more, for Milwaukee, you go to a trial for a black female that's been dismembered, and you got 3 total non-white people on a 12-person jury. 9 people, white people, don't even make up the majority of Milwaukee. It is black people are the biggest racial group, and you only got 2 black people on the jury? And that ain't even this happens all the time. What I just said, you don't have to pile up on those Southern and beat up on Georgia and Texas and all that. That was in Wisconsin, and recent too. Come on, lame book through and through. Anything else I need to get in before we wrap up? Anything else? Basically, unless they call you a nigger, that seems to be at any level. Prosecutors for getting rid of jurors or anything else, or why we don't prosecute white defendants in the same manner or as harshly, unless you got clear evidence that we have called you a nigger or a coon. Ain't nobody racist here. We are all colorblind. Wink, wink. And it's all colorblind because we ain't got no black prosecutor. You might get a Cahill every now and then, a Turn 'em Loose Bruce every now and then, but probably going to be maybe even get a Lance Ito every now and then, get our OJ, but for the most part, no. White people on the bench, white people at the prosecutor's table, white people arresting you through and through. They'll be the ones who are in charge. We'll be here for the Compensate War Counter-Racist Weekly Review, mañana, 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. Holiday weekend. How about that? To see if we can avoid all of the colorblind incarceration. Hey, no Mad Dog 2020 this weekend, or any other concoctions, hallucinogens, barbiturates. Let's keep it sober. We're going to do some Memorial Day. Hey, Black Panther Party. They recognize Geronimo Pratt, Vietnam veteran. We can recognize some of the black people. Neely Fuller Jr., Korean War veteran. We can recognize some of the black attempted counter-racists who were also veterans, Jackie Robinson, recognize their efforts over this weekend without a cocktail champagne beverage. Keep our brain computer working well and see if we're not drinking nothing. Maybe we avoid them handcuffs. Police officers come and say we got unruly with our holiday celebrations. Reckless jocularity, as they call it. Sobriety would be best. Creator, we ask that you remind us, stop saying not all white people are racist. Even if they got black friends and they voted for black people, adopted black children, got 15 copies of Michelle Alexander's book, stop saying not all white people are racist. Stop name-calling people classified as black. It has been time. Replace white supremacy with justice immediately. Cow signing out. Thanks all for tuning in.
Nigga, you so brainwashed.
I'm a victim, brother.
Problem. You're a victim.
Man, I'm a victim of 400 years of conditioning.
Shut up.
The man has programmed my condition. Even my conditioning has been conditioned.